An Ogham Wood by Cliff Sarantine. Acknowledgements. To Daphne, my beloved wife of these many years, you are the steadiness that keeps me focused. To Ariel, my awesome daughter, your faith in magic and your stories of reaching for it are very much at the heart of this novel. To Natalia, my other awesome daughter, your penchant for will and whimsy are a fire of inspiration. To Will-O-Wisp, my faithful dog, you'll never read this, little buddy, but watching you lie on your pillow in the study, patiently waiting for the word processor to go off so we could go chase sticks, kept me driven to get the day's work done. To Mike, Tom, and Andre, your classes in my early university years remain an inspiration. And to Lil Bit, my sweet, adorable, cuddly, attention-craving cat, get the hell off the keyboard. In the popular creed, there is some strange connection between the elves and the trees. They not only frequent them, but they make an interchange of form with them. The Fairy Mythology by Thomas Kitely. Chapter 1. Such cries the fair ass where I weep, when wist no more the fens will keep. O who will guard the westering land, with shadows dashed, enchantment banned. The Lament of Hawthorne by Sheridan, Bard of the Westernmost Tua. The most beautiful thing about the sea was how it made him forget. Sweyn had always held to that. After his mother died of cancer when he was a child, Sweyn used to paddle a sea kayak with his father to numb the pain. When he and his father bitterly parted ways many years later, sailing helped heal the wound. When he lost his wife, he simply floated away like so much flotsam upon an ocean whose greatest gift was forgetfulness. It was easy to get lost in the rhythms of his small ship. The routine of checking position, keeping watch, mending sails, washing lines, polishing and varnishing endlessly. There was always activity to do in the small space of the vessel, and the creaking and groaning of the timbers, the timeless play of waves, the liquid music of water rolling across the hull, all of it conspired to wipe out the thoughts, the memories. Sometimes Sweyn awoke and did not know for certain how long it had been since the last date he remembered. Sometimes he was not even certain of the year. Best of all was when he could barely wrap his mind around the things he needed so desperately most of all to forget. When the gales blew, on approach to one nameless port or another, at night, when the phosphorescent waves washed over seawalls and broke over submerged rocks, unseen but deadly, well capable of ripping away keel and bilge should he wander back to a memory and forget to watch his compass and stay his course. At such times, all his concentration was focused. There was only his body working hard to make his vessel do what needed to be done: reef a sail, shorten a sheet, dare a jibe. The vessel required seamless attention. He knew the vessel and worked her automatically. His muscles were wiry but strong, flowing like fluid over bone, wrought of long days' exhausting work, all to make a vessel of many tons do the will of the single man who piloted her. And all to forget. The sea was a balm. It could wipe away memories. It could do away with the pain of the past, with the pain of loss. And so he called the sea his abode. He had for many years. Once it was the salt air, the sound of rolling surf, the lucid skies that called to him. Once it was the thrill of seeing far-flung shores, the promise of peoples and places unseen. But now it no longer mattered. The sea was an amnesic, better than alcohol, better than a vat of the hardest liquor. It was a place to lose the self and the soul. And so he drifted from bay to cove and port, and sometimes merely hove to upon vast aquamarine expanses, always moving, going nowhere, not in long years. He drifted, detached, looking only for the oblivion of the waves. And there were times when Sweyn could almost forget. The dreaded memories could almost be shoved totally aside, or pushed most deep in the dark recesses within the human soul, where they might be buried and forgotten and never resurface again. Sometimes he had come close, but when he approached the precipice of such oblivion, he felt he teetered on the edge of some sacred space, perhaps akin to the nirvana of nothingness sought by so many of the monks of the exotic East. If he could just tip across the threshold of mind and spirit into that tranquil emptiness and let go once and for all, perhaps the past would release its death grip, and he could be the one thing he had always longed to be, a man not haunted. But his ghosts were cagier than he, for at those very moments when he stood at the frontier of his long-sought bliss, a black cold formed in the core of his breast, and foolish questions provoked his mind to unwanted thoughts. Do you want to forget, truly? Who will remember her if not you? What would be left if you let her go so completely that you could not recall her at all, not even her name. His father and all the hell of his traumatic youth, sure, he could let that go. Gone like the waking after images of nightmare. That side of him could slip away, and he would feel none but the better for it. But when he stood on the brink of forgetfulness and the relentless beauty and indifference and vastness of the sea promised to swallow up his mind and thoughts once and for all, he could never let go. The bitter truth was, the memories which pained him the most were also the dearest. They haunted him with their warmth and tormented him with their loss. He could bear neither to look back upon them, nor to release them. At times he had thought about letting the sea go a step further and make his oblivion complete. So easy it would be to go to sleep in his berth in storm-tossed waters and leave his vessel to its own devices, to its doom. Easier still to simply step off the transom on a good beam reach somewhere far from shores. He had thought it out, how that might be. He would do it near sundown. He would just fall in, tread tropical waters, and watch the beautiful form of starry sea reduce in the distance till at last she was a spot upon a dimming horizon, following her course by the guidance of the autopilot. And when at last she had gone far out of sight, perhaps to be found and claimed by some lucky soul and change his life for the better, Sweyn could just stop treading, close his eyes, and let himself float down to where forgetfulness is assured, into the dark place beneath the rolling ink of the nighttime sea. But he never could do that. It wasn't that he was afraid to die. It was truer to say Sweyn was afraid to live. But it would be the same as coming to that mindless point where he let the abandon of the sea swallow up his memories once and for all. All the goodness ensconced in those painful recollections would vanish with him, and he could not bear to let what those memories contained vanish entirely from the world. And so his memories drove him to persist, and something else, perhaps, but for the life of him he could not understand what. Whatever it was kept him from simply drowning in a bottle, or in the waves. It kept him merely drifting, bobbing, atop and over one endless wave after another. In that moment his vessel was cascading down over a rolling wave, heaped high and steep by a rapidly building wind. He was an adept seaman, but he hardly noticed, nor had he plotted a course. He only went, sailing swiftly, mindlessly, keeping a beam reach to the wind, following it wherever it led. For what else was there in life for him but to follow the wind, a storm-tossed spirit condemned to relentless journeys? He ignored the world around his vessel and looked only inward. There, a side of him, cold and analytical and professional, and more dead than the rest of him, told him he did not have to be this way. He could get help. He was suffering an illness, a deep bitterness of mind, depression. He needed to mourn and to say goodbye, but he could not. It hurt too much to mourn, for mourning required thinking on that which had been lost, and that which had been lost had been too dear to lose. He could not bear to go there, and so his heart was torn. He could not hurt and heal. He dared not mourn and forget. He could only drift and wander, carrying his pain and his memories at as much distance as the sea allowed. A girl came up the companionway, a woman really, but the way of her was girlish, somewhere between that shy age of discovery and the full blossom of womanhood. Her hair was ruby, so lustrous it possessed an inner fire like the fine garnets cherished by gemologists. She was pale-skinned, in the way of most true redheads, but her eyes possessed that unusual red-gold hue sometimes found in very fair folk. They were eyes like that of a cat, clever and astute, burning with an intelligence that seemed to hint at an awareness of hidden things. She moved with the grace of a cat, too. Her slender form ghosted up the steep steps of the companionway and into the cantered cockpit as though she walked on a level surface. She moved across the short space of deck, up over the bench, to rest in the seat beside him with the fluidity of a ballerina. Often he had thought she must have taken lessons and been quite good somewhere back in her teenage years, but when he had brought it up to her, she had laughed and shrugged it off, saying she had never danced that way. "They say some of us have the grace of the little people," she told him once, her reedy voice spiked with a thick brogue that told of links to the British Isles. But she never spoke of her past. For her, it was a closed book, and given her tumultuous childhood, he could understand her desire not to go there. Her past was past, just like his. She held a steaming mug of tea in her hands, though they were en route to Hawaii and Washington, and had already traveled 500 miles south and west away from the mainland. They had already had the misfortune of encountering a late-season northwesterly moving south. In its death throes, it brought increasingly bitter air to the point where Sweyn was beginning to see his breath in wispy streamers that vanished behind him in the building wind. "Do you think it'll be a gale, then?" Aylwin asked of him. He scanned the sky. Amorphous clouds formed a lowering ceiling. It seemed as if all the sky were swathed in a sheet of mist, and the air itself was getting heavier. He nodded to her, took the mug gratefully in one hand, and gulped down several swallows of the warming liquid. The mixture was fragrant. The scent of it lingered on the tongue as well. It tasted of blossoms he could not recognize, and spices and herbs not to be found in the common market. The warmth of the steaming liquor spread through him like gentle fingers massaging the blood back into his chilled skin. It was her own concoction, an old family recipe handed down from the old country. It was naturally sweet, and, along with its warming properties, invigorated him as well as if he had had a cat nap. They bantered back and forth as he finished the cup, then set it aside in an enclave normally reserved for the sailing winch. Till she brought the tea, he had been thinking of putting on the autopilot and letting the device man the helm for him a bit while he went below for a quick warm-up. But now he felt 100% better. Smiling despite the chill and the building cold wind, he rested a hand gently on her knee and said, "I don't think it'll get too bad. It's too late in the season, and the weatherfax hasn't given any cause to think something big is in the works." Elwyn, for all her strong heart, was new to the sea. She shared it gladly with Sweyn, and she took to every aspect of it well, but there was a lot of adjustment in it for her as well. It was all new to her, this cruising life, everything from the glory of setting sails in the air of a crispy new day to the grimy work of cleaning bilges before buildup of muck got a chance to foul the electric bilge pump. She was a novice with a natural love for his maritime world, and though she was taking to it as her own, she had never before ridden through a real, true blow. He shrugged in way of reassurance. "If it blows, it's no big deal. Starry Sea is a sailboat, love. She's made for the wind. We'll heave to, put a pot of tea in a thermos, and ride the rollers like kids on a roller coaster." The idea of waves big enough to compare to roller coasters may not have been the best analogy, for Elwyn's pale skin became a shade whiter. He understood her feelings. The sea is an intoxicating place to be, until one faces the prospect of encountering one's first true gale. The only way to develop the confidence to see one through was to undergo the experience for oneself. Sweyn had been a novice too once, some 20 years before. He remembered how it was. Now Eowyn must herself undergo that baptism. But she was too nervous, and there was no call for that. She would see. A boat like Starry Sea was made to ride the winds, and a gale was just a big blow. To change the subject and ease her mind, he leaned his head toward the now empty mug and brought up a topic he had suggested many a time before. "You should sell that stuff. People would come from far and wide to drink your teas." While his goal had mainly been to divert her, it was no empty compliment he paid. They had talked about the prospect before. She was good with herbs, apparently having picked up some unique lore in the matter in the course of her unusual half-old world upbringing. And she loved working with them. At their home in Glacier Falls, on the west coast of Washington, she kept a splendid herb garden. Everything grew there, all the herbs he could name on a gourmet grocer's shelf, and many, many plants he had neither heard of, nor could pronounce the names of either. She made medicine from some of them, simple but effective home remedies. He had once seen her give a dose of some syrupy decoction to a neighbor's coughing child, and the cough immediately quit. Later that week, the neighbor had come by with a thank you card and words of heartfelt appreciation, for nothing the doctor had given her child had eased the chronic cough. And Eowyn also spiced food with her herbs. The dishes were to die for, strange things he had not had in all his life of traveling to foreign ports. He enjoyed at her table, when they first started dating, a strange stew which seemed to contain some kind of edible grit. Later he learned it was some unique blend of haggis, a dish he would have thought revolting, made of sheep innards and unrolled oats stuffed into a sheep's stomach. He had tried confections of valerian and other herbs which soothed more potently than would have a glass of rum. She made a slightly sweet, astonishingly good wort from oat malt and some herbs she would not name. In her cupboards were jar after jar of varieties of dried chamomile, wormwood, bluebell, rose and rosehip, catnip, comfrey, marshmallow, and a cacophony of other herbs stored, dried, decocted, infused, powdered, crushed, and folded. The house smelled of earth and green things, and the scent permeated her as well. But most special of all were her teas. Some could send a confirmed insomniac to his dreams, while others could beckon a confirmed narcoleptic to the waking world. And he should know, he had once given them to a couple of his own most difficult patients. Some could drive away the most persistent body aches, and others could halt and turn a fever in an hour. But the most spectacular of all her magical infusions were those she blended for the pure enjoyment of sipping a fragrant cup of tea. They were delightful mixtures full of flavor and fragrance and liquid gold warmth that flowed through the veins with a soothing yet invigorating effect Sweyn had once clinically described as far more complex and satisfying than simple caffeine. But Eowyn had always been reserved about her gift with herbs, shrugged off Swyn's compliments as the mere, but not unappreciated, sweet nothings of a man in love. But today, with the storm imminent as the winds built and the barometer steadily dropped, the sea becoming noisier around him, she broke his concentration from the demanding act of steering at a smooth 40-degree angle over the waves with a surprise statement, "I have indeed decided to start a tea shop." He looked at her, sure at first she was teasing, but there was a twinkle in her eye, the kind that harbingers plans in the works, and happy business. Sweyn could read those kinds of cues well. He was a certified expert at it. She continued, "And I am going to call it enchanted herbs, because you're always telling me how magical my teas are." Sweyn raised his eyebrows, happily surprised by the news. He raised a hand, balled loosely, to give her a playful tap on the chin, when suddenly her eyes grew wide and she sat straight up, looking to the port of Starry Sea. "Will you watch the waves now, or we've all had the last of my splendid teas?" He jerked his head left and saw that he had let his attention falter from the rudder too long. Starry Sea was coming to take the natural course of any sailing vessel, a beam of the wind. Calmly but immediately he veered the helm hard to port till her bow was angled 40 degrees off the rollers once more. He chuckled. She had good sea sense about her, but these waves presented no real risk, not yet. Hitting their rounded tops would make for a bumpy ride, but not roll his hefty cutter. He patted her knee again and thanked her for the timely directive. She rose to go back below, muttering something about men drivers and no wonder their insurance is higher. A large wave rolled under the boat and shook her heavily, startling Sweyn back to the present moment. He let out a long gasp, coughed, sputtered as if he had been drowning. It was always like that when he came out of a flashback, though they had come and gone so often he was learning to transition between them and the real world better after all these years. At least this time the flashback had been a happy one, with her alive and sparkling beside him. Coming out of the bad ones was worse, much worse. But even the happy ones bit, for they forced him to face all over again what he had lost. Eowyn was gone, 3 years now, and all that was left to him were memories hard to bear that came and went at their whim, like ghosts. But there was no time to think of it. Wind and waves were building around him, demanding his full attention. The wind was going pretty good now, 25 knots. To a lesser seaman it might have been time to heave to. For Sweyn, who had spent so much of his life upon the waters, it was no more than a challenge, something to keep his thoughts from turning inward where the real storm raged. In there, he was always on the brink of tears like rain, and rage like a tempest. There had been times when he had broken down like that. For months after that tragic spring night 3 years ago, he had railed against the acrimony of life, the callous cruelty of whatever sublime beings allowed him a brief sense of love and closeness, then ripped it all away and tore it to shreds as though it had all been the practical joke of bored gods who toyed with men's hearts for sport. He had railed until he nearly lost his sanity and vomited his hurt, and the rest of his heart too, out into the world. In the end, only a numb husk of himself had remained, and that part took to the sea once and for all, seeking oblivion. 1,000 days ago that had been to the mark, but who's counting? He asked himself silently. And of course he knew he was. He was counting the days as if waiting, but for what he did not know. Perhaps the next flashback. He lived in terror of them, for every time they came, they made all the grief new again, and they stole a little piece of himself in their passing. But he also longed for them, for in those brief instances of insanity he was with her again, with Eowyn, when life was worth living. But there were times when the dark memories came. Then there were only horrible recollections of screams in the night, fire on dark water, and the silhouette of a man watching beneath the wan orange illumination of sodium vapor streetlights. When those flashbacks came, he did terrible things. He stabbed at the air with knives. He smashed heavy tools into fittings. He became crazed and dangerous in a desperate, mad attempt to get at that dark figure. Perhaps it was those dark flashbacks as much as anything that kept him drifting upon the sea. When they came, who knew what terrible things he might do? It was certain he had done terrible things in the past. He had shed blood. But no time to think on that now. Cold spray blew off a wave, and he realized his mind was wandering again. He forced himself by sheer will into the moment. The wind had picked up to 30 knots, and without attention to the helm the sailboat was broaching, turning beam to the wind where a building wave might roll her. And suddenly a bizarre thought hit him. He could not be certain. Memories of the past days were a strange, timeless blur. But he could not recall the last time he had taken a position fix with a sextant or simply glanced at the chart plotter. And with that thought, he realized the local water was cold. But that could not be right. He should be somewhere just south of the equator, in the middle of the Pacific. He blinked, looked around, and exclaimed, "Where the hell am I?" A coast was coming into view. Lots of mountains. Blue sky over the mountains presenting a calmness that belied the storm-force winds that drove Starry Sea relentlessly toward them. His seaman's instincts began to take over as he pondered questions which must now be answered. What kind of coast lay out there? Were there riptides? Rocky outcroppings? Unexpected shallows where submerged mountains nearly surfaced from the sea, but not quite? On some coasts there was a small chance a whirlpool could be encountered, though they were exceedingly rare. Of greater concern was passing ship traffic. Though the sky was yet clear, the weather would likely bring clouds and poor visibility, or the building wind could curl the rollers into whitecaps and rip foam from them, creating a white haze. He might encounter some great nearsighted freighter in that soup that would plow him under, or worse, some other vessel his own size, whom he might accidentally harm. Sweyn had little care for himself, but he was not yet so bitter that he would callously bring hurt to others. So he let himself shift mental gears, focusing on the concerns of piloting a sailing yacht. It was his special oblivion, a way to drown out the pain of all the memories, the fair and the foul. He began by considering the prospect of a forced landfall. The wind was blowing him hard toward the lee shore, and he didn't see much chance of avoiding it. But to land safely, he needed to know the lay of the coast, and he was forced to face again the startling fact that he had no idea where he was. He could have been somewhere off the coast of Siberia, or 10,000 miles away near New Zealand for that matter. He shook his head briskly. It felt as if he were shrugging off intoxication, yet he had drunk nothing. The land before him was rugged. There was no sign of civilization, no smog, no lights, no roads to be seen through binoculars. Certainly he had drifted somewhere remote and wild. How long has it been since I got a fix on my position, he thought again and tried to recall. But the more he pondered it, the more it came to him that his last days or weeks had passed as a blur. Am I dissociating, he wondered aloud? Was he really losing it that bad? Since the loss of Éowyn, he had never really been concerned for where he was going, and sometimes he would pass several days without glancing at charts. But for all that, he was too much the seaman not to at least take an occasional position fix. He felt responsible for his vessel, if not himself. But now his mind held only hazy recollections of sitting by the wheel, steering straight and true on some unknown course to a perfect beam reach for untold days and nights. He had not even glanced at the compass in all that time. Not once. "What's wrong with me?" he whispered quickly. But land was approaching fast and the wind still built. The anemometer now read 35 knots. He could try to beat into it and get away from that strange coast, but that would put the boat through a terrible pounding. Starry Sea was a heavy cruising vessel, not some lithe racer, not so nimble as to turn into such a wind as this and slice easily through the mounting rollers. He might be better off to try to find some small cove in that rugged coast. Maybe. He was now running 7 knots before the wind, with perhaps 20 miles to land, less than 3 hours to find a safe haven. In sailors' terms, the blink of an eye. He had to know where he was. He rounded Starry Sea, and the brief moment the vessel turned broadside to the waves, she took a mighty pounding, nearly laid flat to her mast by the onslaught of wind and water. But the faithful old cutter completed the turn, and he rolled up her genoa, set the mainsail to heave her to. Fixing the helm just to windward, he plunged down the companionway ladder and used a bit of his precious electricity to operate the chart plotter. It only took a minute for it to find and indicate the vessel's position, though the minute seemed much longer with Sweyn's growing awareness of the looming coast. Yet despite being pressed for time, the need to assess his position and act quickly, what he saw on the glowing color liquid crystal screen of the chart plotter froze him. It could not possibly be. Certain there must be an equipment flaw, he turned off the chart plotter, then turned it on again a minute later. Another timeless minute flowed as it reacquired its position. West Coast it read, British Columbia, not too far south of the Alaska Panhandle. He shook his head, utterly in disbelief. The last time he had taken a position, he had been drifting becalmed in waters south of Hawaii, in the doldrums where wind rarely blew. Since that time he had no clear recollection, just sitting and sailing, riding the wind on his beam. So how much distance have I covered? He asked himself silently. Several thousand miles at least, but that would have taken weeks. No wind would blow steady and true on his beam for weeks. He could not possibly have done nothing but sit at the helm and steer all that time. Could he? He recalled the hypnotic effect of driving. Some people can get in their car and drive to a place, and when they reach it, they have almost no recollection of the act of getting there. This was like that. He only vaguely remembered the act of sailing, but he had no idea of what exactly had occurred between when he started and when he got here, nor how long he had been at it. And he damn sure knew he hadn't plotted a course to bring him this way. Could he have come here by accident? What were the odds? Could he have piloted his vessel for weeks in driver's hypnosis? He might be messed up, but he knew he wasn't that messed up. Am I? He reached right and grabbed his log, opened it swiftly to his last entry. He had always been a rigorous log keeper, keeping track of every hour of engine time used, every bit of maintenance performed, every course plotted and run. Opening it, he saw his last entry was on April 14. He checked the date on a digital stopwatch hanging from the porthole near the tiny navigation station. It confirmed the date as yesterday, but there was something wrong with the entry. The handwriting didn't look like his, and all it reported was, still sailing northwest, to the island. The island? A coldness ran through his gut. He looked suddenly right into his stateroom, then left into the aft stateroom, then the galley. It felt as if he were searching for someone who might have written that entry. But surely there could be no stowaway aboard. You can't sneak on board a little sailboat, he told himself aloud, as if for reassurance. Then a more horrible thought occurred to him. He began saying symptoms out loud: loss of time, dissociation, stress, paranoia. He was, or more accurately had been, a psychologist, though it seemed now like it had been another lifetime altogether. He already knew he suffered depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. Knew it, but didn't care. Didn't feel there was anything to be done about it except hope to heal or asphyxiate in it. Either way, he didn't care. But it could get worse. Under the right duress one could experience fugue, a strange sort of delirium that set one wandering and senseless. A wave smashed into Starry Sea's hull, rolled over the deck of the boat. Sweyn was lurched violently forward, banging his head against the stainless steel frame of the porthole over the navigation station, then fell back onto the settee, where he flopped over like a rag doll, and slid off the starboard settee down between the table leg and the settee where he lay unconscious and immobile, firmly braced against the violent rolling motion of the storm-tossed little cutter. The sun continued to climb the chill sky, and the approaching clouds made it gray over the sea, though a band of clear blue was tucked behind the ridge of serrated mountains towering in the northeast. Their height and ancient massive strength held back the onslaught of the weather. Pale light shone through the smooth slate of cloud, leaching out the color from the world beneath. The sea became the color of the sky, the color of ash from fire pits which had once burned hot, but had long since gone cold. The unusually colored hull of Starry Sea, sky blue on deck, azure down the hull all the way to the waterline, faded into two muted tones. The rigging had been color-coded to help Éowyn find her way around the sails long ago, when she'd been a novice aboard Starry Sea: white for the mainsail, red for the staysail, and blue for the huge Genoa, whose massive stay was mounted into the bowsprit. Now all these vivid colors seemed to blend like vegetables whose essence had been sapped away in boiling stock. Even the bright orange reflective streamers flying from two of the vessel's 6 shrouds, which Sweyn had set up to add visibility to his boat, lost their vividness, fading to a wan yellow as if drowned in smog. But there was no smog. The air in this part of the world was pure as can still be found. It was sweet with the smell of forest land growing dangerously, rapidly closer, and tangy with the salt spice of the roaring sea. It bit with the nip of a clean cold squall descending on Starry Sea from the southwest. The growing murk was due to nothing other than weather conditions growing dreadful, misty rain and wind ripping foam from the waves. Had Sweyn been conscious, he could no longer have seen the land. But Sweyn was not conscious. He lay below upon the sole of the saloon, wedged tightly between the leg of the table and the starboard side settee. Had he been awake, he would have been in pain, for his ribs were bent near to breaking. But luck had not entirely failed the leathery mariner, for this was also the safest place for him to be. For the sea rocked the boat wildly, and twice knocked her down. But while he was held steady, the last knockdown had torn the clew of the mainsail from the boom. Still attached to the mast at 2 points, the sail flapped wildly, crepitating like the smack of little thunder, claps and the cracking of small fireworks. It shook the mast so furiously that the whole vessel shuddered. With no sail to hold her hove to, Starry Sea turned abeam to the frothing sea. She rocked violently as her keel was grabbed by each passing wave. Within the vessel, pantries flew open and unsecured dry goods spilled out, creating a wet mess of flour and sugar in the galley and on the sole. A large handheld spotlight flew from a cabinet over the navigation station and smashed into the starboard settee, falling harmlessly onto the cushions over Sweyn's left shoulder. Had he been standing there, the impact of the blow might have been lethal. At the least, he would have had broken bones to remember it by. But Starry Sea was a sound little ship, built 75 years earlier of solid oak and purple heart. Her spine and ribs were thick and curved to hold the sea. Her keel was built right into the lines of ribs and spine, so that it almost formed one solid piece with the hull, giving the vessel incredible strength. Half her 10 tons she carried as ballast, and it was this weight that held the boat keelside down into the waters, despite the mad waves. So luck was with Sweyn in this moment. Luck that he had owned a sound of old vessel, luck that he had kept her up so well, loving her as his own kin, nursing her to the best of health. Starry Sea had stamina to hold her own, at least for a while. But no vessel can stand up to the pounding of the sea forever, and without a skipper to implement good tactics, a sea storm will eventually win out. But in this moment, Starry Sea had no skipper. Her skipper had found a moment of perfect oblivion at last, a moment where he could not be haunted by any memories whatsoever. In honor of those memories, Sweyn would never have taken his own life, though if the sea was going to take him, he had no qualms. If he had been awake, he might have considered this a fitting way to wink out of the world. But luck was not through with Sweyn. It had not been luck that gave him a coldly professional, detached father who drove him away in the end, nor had it been luck that stole away his beloved Eowyn. But as fate would have it, it was luck that brought the storm, and something like it that brought him north, beginning so many weeks ago, with hardly a conscious reckoning, sailing mindlessly with a strange beam wind that never failed, never wavered. And though a storm raged around him that might easily have swamped the unmanned vessel, luck saw that the small bit of line holding the anchor to the bowsprit was stripped away as the bow plunged into a wave and was momentarily awash in its incomprehensible force. Starry Sea rose on the back of that wave, her bow flying clear of the sea, then plunged down the face of another, her keel biting deep into the water so that she seemed to surf. The natural aquadynamic tendency of her lines moved the bow ahead as she shot down the waves, and this time the anchor, a heavy 50-pound Bruce, was ripped from the bowsprit, training chain, and then rowed behind it. The little cutter was thrust ahead by the wind, while the weighty anchor and its heavy chain and rowed were pulled out by the cartwheeling action of the rolling waves, dragging the anchor rapidly out and deeper into the sea. Suddenly the row had reached its end, but it had been fastened in two places by the meticulous seaman, one inside the anchor locker at the forwardmost part of the bow, and another at the starboard bow cleat. The anchor line stretched taut as the Bruce anchor caught the water, digging into the brine almost as if it dug into the loose sand of a tropical anchorage. The pressure on the line was tremendous, but the hardware on the bowsprit was beefy and solidly joined to the ship. Starry Sea shuddered halfway up the next mighty white-crested wave. Then she pitched around on the road as if it were a bridle, now facing directly into the onslaught of the sea. Now the waves came at her from straight on, were cut by her bow, and foamed and hissed harmlessly by. Several black faces appeared for an instant in the foam. They could have been sea otters, but it was far from land for sea otters. More likely they were storm-tossed roots of sea onions, knots of kelp. But they did not look like it. The wind shifted, backing so that it ran somewhat parallel to the looming coast. It dragged Starry Sea with it, but the wind still worked the cutter landward, and the craggy roots of mighty mountains waited, now only a few miles away. Time passed, and as it did, the wind began to relent, but it did the little cutter no good, for the seafloor was rising to meet the land, causing the angry sea to throw up wild waves. The angle of the hull shifted a bit, or perhaps the Bruce anchor did through some quirk of imbalance in how it was fastened to the boat, so that the little cutter came to rest at an angle slightly off the wind. In this luck was also with Sweyn, for now Starry Sea sailed a bit more eastward as she was blown north, as surely as if hands of brine and flesh of fishy things urged her that way. And Starry Sea made her way in a direction Sweyn would never, ever in his life have willingly chosen to go, not even if failing to go that way would have cost him his life and sunk his precious cutter, the last thing he still loved, the last thing he still believed in. For the sea was pushing him home, not his birth home, where his eminent father still practiced his hoodoo and called it psychotherapy, nor did it push him toward Glacier Falls on the Olympic Peninsula of Washington, where he and Eowyn had once lived happily in a rainforest chalet, where she grew her herbs and he ran his charter business. No, what the sea did was far crueler. It pushed him toward the island of Eowyn's birth, a place she had hated and was so bitter against she refused ever to speak of it. And because she had hated it, Sweyn also hated it. Though sometimes, late at night when he slept alone in the double berth of his stateroom, he could almost make out a familiar feminine voice whispering over the lull of the waves on the hull, telling him, "Go home, Sweyn." But he had no home. Every place that was dear to him bore memories of her, and he could not bear to be reminded of so much loss. This hated island was especially rife with her memories, even though he had never been to it, but she had grown up there. It was part of her. She would be everywhere in it, and for that reason, if nothing else, he would never have chosen to go there. But the sea gave him no choice. It blew him relentlessly, inexorably to the island of Manannan. His thoughts took shape. Consciousness sparked. He opened his eyes, then wished he hadn't. There was a pain like a spike in his skull. Reaching up, he felt tenderly at his forehead. It was bruised and sore, but the skin had not broken. There was a mighty lump, though. But to make his head hurt worse, something was creating a grand cacophony, rattling and banging around up above at tremendous volume. The steady snapping, whipping noise was punctuated every couple seconds by a huge, violent clatter, the sound of metal crashing with metal. His foggy mind found it hard to isolate the source of the ruckus, though had he been more clear-headed, he'd have known in an instant and averted the next disaster. But perhaps this, too, was a strange twist of luck. He tried to move and found it impossible. It felt as if another spike had been driven into his chest. He looked down and saw how he had been wedged tight between the single leg of the table and the settee. He raised his arm and pushed up on the table. It lifted on hinges that were attached on one side to a spice shelf/wine rack, bringing up the attached leg with it, freeing him. The relief was immediate, and for the first time in he did not know how long, he could breathe normally. But his chest was stiff and sore, and the act of breathing hurt, especially where his ribs had been bent cruelly by the table leg. Carefully, he moved out of the way and set the table back down, making sure the peg in the foot of the leg found its way into a small hole in the sole drilled especially to hold the table leg square and sound. Slowly, not yet certain of his balance, he took to his feet, hands instinctively grasping overhead for the teak rail that served as a handhold. He was not woozy nor nauseous, and he was immediately relieved, for it meant he had probably not been concussed. The sea still heaved under him, though, starry sea rising and falling on mountainous swells, and he had to watch his footing. Then he noticed a terrible mess in the saloon and cursed under his breath. It would take days to clean up properly. Suddenly, the peril his boat faced returned to him. He glanced out a porthole and saw white foam crests curling past, hissing like freshly opened soda cans as they went. It took him a moment to realize his bow had turned into the waves. Dimly, he wondered how that could be. The last he recalled, he left the helm with the vessel hove to. She should have been pointing about 45 degrees off the wind and waves. But in another instant, the source of the tumult above was realized, as his mind cleared and his well-honed seaman's instincts found place again, and the mystery of his bow-arm angle to the sea was forgotten. The mainsail was flying loose. He turned to dash up the companionway, but no sooner did he set foot upon the first step than there came a tremendous tearing noise, as if an atlas had just ripped a phone book in half all at once. He burst up the steps, spun on his heel, grabbing the railing of the dodger and looking up over it. The mainsail, which had been reefed, had broken free of the binding ropes and had been flapping around wildly against the shroud secured to the mast only at the peak and base, and just now it had ripped, tearing neatly from the bottom to the top, from halfway along the foot of the sail to the luff. The torn half could still be seen blowing away in the wind, fluttering over the breaking waves like some drunken seabird, till, a quarter-mile off the stern, it dropped from the sky, hit the water, and vanished from sight. He cursed then as only a seaman can curse. He had, in that moment, effectively lost his primary engine. He still had his diesel below, but a diesel is an ungainly source of propulsion for a sailboat, and his sailboat in particular was designed to sail, not motor. Without his mainsail, his craft would find no steadiness over the waves. She would sway precariously in any mild wind. Travel without his main was dangerous at best. Instinct took over again, though. The first order of business, minimized the damage. He had been wearing a harness, and he secured himself to a jackline to keep himself from going overboard should he lose his balance. Then he climbed up around the dodger, intending to take down the flailing remnant of the mainsail and put an end to the clatter of its shackles smacking into the aluminum mast. Watching the wet, rolling deck before him, gripping handholds with white-knuckled fierceness as he worked his way forward, he made his way to the mast. He loosened the line from a mast winch and began to ease the sail down, furling the torn remnant quickly as he worked so the wind could not grab it. It was soaked and sprayed cold droplets into his face and eyes. The cold quickly penetrated his hands, burning his fingers, but he continued his task, heedless of the pain, lowering the ripped sail to the deck, pressing the folds under a foot to hold them against the wind, hanging on to the hoisting sheet and the torn sail for his life, freezing till his teeth chattered. Then suddenly, the wind died. It took only seconds, and then, like the cessation of a whisper, it went away. The rain also broke in that moment, and streams of sunlight shafted down from breaks opening in the clouds. He looked up from his work and found that Starry Sea had just rounded a point and been blown into a bay. He had rounded points and found shelter from winds before, but never so abruptly. He looked to his left. Steep wooded mountains rose against the wind, now coming mostly out of the west. The mountains ended in abrupt cliffs at land's edge, forming an immediate wall against the weather, cutting the outside world off from this sheltered bay. Still, he should have had to drift further back into the bay for the mountain's shielding effect to really take hold. It was odd the wind should break so abruptly, with the wide open sea only 20 yards behind him, and even if the bay had provided a particularly effective wind block, that should not have arrested the rain, nor broken the clouds. But he was well aware that strange things happened at sea. Still, knowing that could not have prepared him for what would happen next. He looked ahead and was frozen by what he saw. Some dark thing, almost as large as a man, was crouched on 2 legs in the bowsprit, just in front of the windlass. It was matted in dark, wet, wiry hair. Pointed teeth gleamed from a pink mouth as though it were grinning. It stared silent and still at him. It could only be some odd marine animal he had never seen before, and was no doubt as surprised by his presence as he was by its. But the face, half hidden beneath that snarl of wiry hair, looked queerly human. Long-fingered hand-like paws clutched at something sinuous and creamy white. A strip of sailcloth it seemed to be. And then, with a grace surprising of the gangling, crouching wild thing, it slipped off the bow into the brine, even now calming to easy 5-foot rollers with the passing of the storm-force wind. He stood there, clinging to rope and sail, close beside the mast. Starry sea settled out under him, riding the gentling surf easier now. He paid the change no mind. His jaw was half open, full of wonder, like when he had been a boy in a sea kayak and had seen his first gray whale broach the surface from no more than 2 arm lengths away. The experience of marine life was one of the best salves of the sea, one of the wonders that could temporarily drive away the pain. But never in all his years afloat had he seen such a beast as what he had just witnessed. With the wind gentling to under 10 knots, and the clouds breaking up into compact fluffs of white cumulus with streamers of afternoon sun bursting through, he let go the ragged mane and stepped forward, eyes glued to the spot where the creature had been. What in the world had it been? Something he did not know. Maybe even something heretofore unknown and unseen by man. Could he have inadvertently discovered a new species? He stepped up to the bowsprit and knelt where the thing had been. Watery paw prints were visible on the wooden deck. At least he had not imagined it. Gingerly, he touched a print, traced his finger through it. The print was disturbingly human, bulbous where a heel might have been, elongated toward the balls of the feet, wide before the toes. And there were little circles where toes might have been. If he did not know better, he would have sworn these were the prints of something very like a man. Movement caught his eye to starboard and port of the bow. Porpoises swam beneath the surface, gliding alongside Starry Sea, slipping playfully beneath her keel. On a calmer day he might have been able to see them better, but in the recent stirred-up water, still hazy with bubbles and remnants of foam, there were dark shadows beneath a green surface. They moved as fluid elementals, casting about playfully as they chased each other and dared dives under the keel. Occasionally, a shadow's tail seemed to fork as though it were legs, as though it were the phantom of a man or a woman gallivanting about down there. He stood up, holding onto the life rail with his right hand, the left wrapped around the furled genoa for support. A sea otter poked its head out of the water, staring intently at him, at Starry Sea. These creatures were notoriously curious, fascinated by vessels, and especially music. Their precocious habits endeared them to him. Sometimes he would drift in a cove and play music loudly on the boat's stereo to entice him. Then they would gather round about the cutter, floating on their backs as they listened to the music and watched the boat with a queer bright curiosity. But this otter regarded him with something more. Its dark gaze seemed to bore into him, and there was an unsettling sense of intelligence burning in its night-black eyes. Sweyn gazed back. Time seemed to pass as man and sea animal studied one another. The porpoises continued to slip fore and aft, and sometimes traded sides. When at last the otter rolled over and slipped beneath the waves, and the spell was broken, Sweyn did not know how much time had passed. A long time, surely. It was then he realized why the boat's bow had mysteriously turned into the waves. The Bruce anchor was all the way out, somehow having come loose of its tie-down while he was unconscious, and acted as a sea anchor. The first time that's ever happened, he thought, and rose to go back to the cockpit where he would engage the windlass and pull the sea anchor back in. But turning that way, he suddenly faced the stern of Starry Sea, the direction in which she was drifting. The great clouds were now half gone. A high sun spilled warm gold, illuminating steep mountains, dark woods of deciduous trees, and a break in the mountains where flat land spilled out toward the sea. There lay a small green valley, and a silver band of river ran through the midst of it, emptying into the bay. At the mouth of the tiny river was a small village. He was perhaps 2 miles away now, but he could make out the forms of whitewashed plastered cottages and larger wooden structures, all trimmed with vivid blues, greens, and reds. Sunshine spilled down upon the village, as if marking it for landfall. And he knew the place, too. He could not believe he was here, had never, ever intended to come here, would never have dared it, not in the blackest pit of his nightmares, for if unsought memories were anywhere to be found aside from Glacier Falls, they were here, in this village he had never been to before in his life. but by the profile of the village against the verdant valley backdrop, and its unusual old-world architecture, which he had seen in photographs and in oil painting Éowyn had kept over the fireplace in the chalet at Glacier Falls, he could tell this was Man by the Sea, Éowyn's birthplace. Memories of her would be thick here, and being in the midst of them would cost him dear in sorrow. But also, in this place was the inheritance Éowyn had left him, a legacy he had never even considered claiming. Yet Starry Sea continued to drift landward, and he leaned against her forestay weak-kneed. For all he was worth, he'd have turned and run back for the sea right now if he could. But Starry Sea was crippled, her mainsail gone, and no telling what other damage she had sustained while he had been insensible below. The wind carried him toward the village's pier, while the strength seemed to flow out of him like water. He had things to do, preparations to make for landfall, an anchor to bring in, a sail to secure, fenders to put out, and 100 other things to attend to. But it was all he could do to stand and hold his balance and keep his sanity against the memories which threatened to overwhelm him now, bright and dark memories goaded into consciousness by the sudden unexpected presence of this village and this island where Éowyn had grown up. "How did I come here?" he begged of the air, but no answer was returned. He was lost, he knew, half mad, he knew, and now he felt powerless, a thing he had never before felt, not upon the sea, his element. Yet it was the sea which carried him relentlessly home. Chapter 2. Some spin wool for homespun cloth, some spin silk for finer stuff, some spin gold and fair the treasure, some spin mist and hard the measure. I spin the gayest, and lives I weave, with twines of luck to bind the sheaves. Ellidurydd, the Lady of the Brooks. The sea drove him a mile closer to shore. From his vantage on the bow, where he stood confused and frozen, he could make out the lay of the place. Beaches of grey sand stretched out in a wide crescent south of Man by the Sea. Just east of the village lay shallows. He could tell as he watched the diminishing rollers, now only 4 feet high, break into white foamers where the waves climbed up the rising sea bottom and toppled over themselves. The water there also had a murky look, the way it gets around thickets of kelp. That area was a navigation hazard to be avoided at all costs. Beyond the shallows were moors that stretched back to an unbroken forest of hardwood, which wrapped around both village and bay in the manner of a protective cloak. The hardwoods were a bizarre sight here in the Pacific Northwest, where coniferous rainforest predominated. But Éowyn, the mere recollection of her name made him wince, had told him long ago that the original settlers of the island had planted the forest some 2 centuries back. According to legend, the settlers had gone all over the island, sowing seeds that replaced the autochthonous cedars and spruces, tamaracks and firs. The seeds had come from European hardwood forests, and the trees that sprang from those seeds had taken well to the sweet, rich loam of the island. At least, that was the story according to the old rememberers. What was it she had called them? The Shonakis? The hardwood forest soon came to cover the whole island, from the beaches back to the heights of the mountains on the north side where the land was rugged and inhospitable. It had displaced the old forest entirely, and grown with such amazing fecundity it looked as if it had existed on the island since long days before the coming of the colonists. Man by the Sea itself was a tiny hamlet, spanning only a couple 100 yards of beach. It appeared to go back no deeper, ending abruptly at the forest edge and to the north at the river. Whorls of smoke rose from many of the brightly painted shops and cottages. The storm had brought cool temperatures, and some occupants had lit hearths. Éowyn had told him the villagers disdained many modern amenities, including the use of liquid fuels, and the white tufts of smoke he spotted had their origins in wood and peat. Even from out here, he could smell the pungent fragrance of the smoke. He could see no power lines from this distance, and though there were paved roads along the waterfront, only a few cars and trucks used them, meandering patiently up and down the village's byways. They appeared as crawling painted dots, gleaming metallic in the brightened sun. The cars weaved around slower things in the road, pedestrians and, he realized after a moment, horses drawing carts. He breathed shakily and worked his way back to the cockpit, reached under the Dodger for his Steiner binoculars, faithful old rubber-armored 7x50s, and glassed out the scene. It was a sight out of time and reminded him of someplace else he had seen once. Many hundreds of miles north on the southern coast of Alaska was a small, old Russian village. The villagers lived in high-gabled cottages and log cabins. The men worked in drab canvas pants and flannel shirts. The women wore bright layers of thin skirts handmade from pastel-colored cotton and simple white blouses cut in 19th century Russian peasant style. Capped in white bonnets and wrapped in brightly dyed shawls, the women appeared as blossoms against the endless dark evergreens of the north. The villagers harvested fish from weirs, grew gardens for their produce, and hunted for their meat. They were secluded and introverted, and among themselves spoke a dated Russian. They had cars and electricity, but otherwise were very traditional. Their community appeared to have leapt into the modern era straight out of the 19th century. Sweyn had seen their village on a cruise many years before he had met Eowyn, when he had sailed to Alaska to see the unbroken reaches of forests, the crystal rivers, and fish the abundant wild salmon. Man by the Sea reminded him of that secluded Russian village, but where the Russians could only be described as traditional, these folk were nothing less than backward. They shunned and distrusted technology, using it no more than was absolutely necessary. They had few cars, no village power plant, and when they needed electricity, they made it themselves with home generators or small windmills mounted on poles. Man by the Sea was locked in the past, and Eowyn had described it as doggedly stagnant. For that reason alone he could understand why bright, adventurous Eowyn had abandoned the island almost 19 years ago. He dreaded going there. It would be inbred and he would be out of place. Worst of all, it would be haunted with her memories. But there was simply no choice. He could not take Starry Sea out to sea without a mainsail, nor without an inspection of her hull, but he could make the excursion as brief as possible. As soon as he made land, he would order a sail and have the vessel hauled. He could sleep on the boat and avoid the village. With any luck, he could return to sea in a week. He took another shaky breath, gathered his wits and courage, and made ready to make landfall. He went to the binnacle and flipped the switch that activated the windlass. The powerful electric motor turned the cam that drew the anchor rod. He paused the hoisting every 50 feet to go below and forward to the anchor locker and make sure the rod coiled neatly so it would not tangle. Eventually, a loud thump and growl of metal announced he was now raising the chain secured to the end of the rod. 50 more feet and the chain was in, the anchor firmly seated on the pulpit. He went forward and tied off the anchor, this time doubly securing it with 2 short lengths of quarter-inch braided lines so that it could not possibly come undone on its own again. Then he returned stern, started the engine, and was pleased to hear it rumble smoothly to life. He steered toward the seawall just east and south of Man by the Sea. When the boat was lined up with the entrance to the tiny fishing harbor, he activated the autopilot and went forward to the mast and gathered the remains of the ruined sail, inspecting it as the hank came down. He shook his head. Never in his life had he seen such a tear work through a sail. It was sundered vertically, a neat rip from leech to foot, halfway along the sail's width. The tear was remarkably clean, almost as if it had been cut with a knife. He frowned. Freakish this was, yes, but he had seen strange things upon the lonely reaches of the sea. Yet he could not help but recall the uncanny creature on the bow, holding what looked to be a strip of sailcloth in a hand-like paw. He could almost believe the creature had sabotaged his sail, but that was ridiculous. He went about readying the boat for landfall. There were seacocks to close, fenders to tie off, spring lines to position, and more. He had tied off to a slip on the north side of the docks, a place occupied by a stray fishing boat and a single other sailing yacht passing through. Starry Sea bobbed at her spring lines, which he had snugly secured to hefty cleats on the wooden pier. It did not take him long to find the harbor master, explain how he had taken damage in the storm, and arrange an indefinite stay. The harbor master was a leathery man in his early 70s, still spry, who wore a cap emblazoned with an anchor snagged in a road sewn of gold and red thread. He looked every bit the old sea dog, and even smelled of brine and rum. Sweyn found himself surprised the old fellow did not smoke a curved pipe and speak with a plethora of guttural "ayes" and "mateys." As it was, the harbour master was possessed of a thick brogue, like Scottish or Irish, with a touch of something else, maybe Welsh. It bothered Sweyn, for it was one more thing to remind him of Eowyn, who had had just the same odd music in her tongue. Years ago she had told him that all of Man by the Sea's inhabitants had been something like tinkers, having their origins in Celtic countries of the British Isles. They had originally settled in Scots-dominated Nova Scotia, but were not content to remain in a land with so many outsiders, which seemed to mean anyone not of their number. They wandered the New World over several decades, making their way slowly west, till they came to this uninhabited island and settled in. Having seldom had contact with the outside world, they still retained their accents and cultural distinction. The harbour master was frank and friendly, and offered to provide Sweyn whatever help he could. Despite himself, Sweyn liked the rough-edged seaman. He paid the harbour master for a week of slip fees in advance, and inquired where he could find a chandlery and phones. The harbour master directed him across the street for phones, and south for the chandler. He made his way across the street to a hardware store that doubled as a bait shop and called an old and trusted supplier in Seattle who already had the sales specifications of Starry Sea on record. From that company he ordered a new mainsail, thread, needles, and other bobs and bits he would need to tend the mending and maintenance of his sails. Then he headed south along a paved street in the direction of the Chandler. The business was not big. Man by the Sea had only a small fishing fleet, a dozen or so aging wooden trawlers that could be seen bobbing at the piers behind the diminutive seawall. This one business provided a variety of services for them, everything from installing and maintaining their plumbing and hardware to mending nets and painting hulls. The building seemed deserted when Sweyn entered it. There was no one in sight, and the inventory, a collection of zincs, cans of epoxy and marine-grade paint, and various fittings for plumbing and boat propane systems, was covered with a layer of thick gray dust. And only half the shelves even held inventory. The other half merely stood empty. Perhaps a little later in the year, when the fishing season opened, these shelves would be covered with net, line, and buoys. Sweyn called for someone, but received no answer. He stepped past the aisles, looking down each one, but no one was to be found. As he worked his way toward the back of the shop, movement caught his eye. It turned out to be a hefty tiger-striped tabby, thick-furred and well-rounded from too many meals and not enough mouncing, lounging on a pillow on the counter beside the cash register. One paw rested possessively on the till, as if the feline were guarding it. It eyed him with the semi-interested suspicion typical of its species. A cigar smoked in an ashtray beside the cat, and for a moment Sweyn was confronted with the Alice in Wonderland image of the cat sitting at the till, counting colorful Canadian money and smoking the smelly stogie. Sweyn pushed the image away and chalked it up to too many sleepless nights at sea. He stepped up to the counter. A large, blank notepad was there, and a pen lay beside it. Taped to the counter beside the notepad was a sheet of paper that announced the proprietor was out on business and would be back later. The note also left instructions for the reader to write down what he needed and leave the request. Several such messages were already taped helter-skelter to the counter, requests for marine paints, tackle, blocks, and other miscellany of mariners. "Well, that's just great," grumbled Sweyn. "Back later" might mean minutes or days in a backwater wash like this, and he did not want to spend a minute more in Man by the Sea than he had to. But there was little choice, so he took the notepad and wrote on it the pier where Starry Sea was tied, and a request to dry haul the boat ASAP. He was just tearing a bit of Scotch tape to affix the note to the counter when an obvious thought occurred to him. The proprietor must be nearby if he left a cigar smoking in the ashtray. No sooner did he think it than bells hung from the door chimed at the entryway. He turned and saw a middle-aged woman enter the shop carrying a large, heavy box awkwardly in her arms. Sweyn hurried over to help her with the package, but she shooed him away and staggered to the counter, where she set it down with such a solid thump the cat actually deigned her a glance before returning to the more serious business of looking down its stubby nose at Sweyn. "What can I do for you?" the woman asked Sweyn, as she took the stogie from the ashtray and inserted it into her wide mouth. She was rotund, with a serious face, and wore a skirt of some drab yellow material, hefty workman's boots, all topped off with a dainty blouse over which she wore dark blue, thick slicker. She was a study in contrast, blue-collar grandma. Sweyn could picture her sitting in a rocker, embroidering and sipping tea, while bellowing commands and curses at a crew of rough fishermen from the bridge of a storm-tossed trawler. Sweyn glanced outside. The sun was fully out now, and her garb must have been hot. He decided to make no comment on the coat and said instead, "I didn't expect anyone. The note said you were out for a while." She snickered. "Oh, that. Well, I had to grab a shipment," she patted the box. "But now I'm back. Local folk know what to do if I'm not here. But you're not from these parts, are you?" Sweyn shook his head. "I've got a boat I need hauled. I've been through a storm, and I have to look her over." "Take some damage, did you?" she said. Like everyone else here, she possessed the odd brogue, a mixture of British Isle accents and a bit of Canada. "I don't know. Maybe," he replied. "I'd like to get her out of the water and look her over as soon as possible. Patch her up as she needs it. How soon can you do it?" "Oh, like we have lots to do around here," she chuffed, as she began to remove items from the box, more pipe fittings, and set them haphazardly at the counter's edge. "I'll send my boy to tend to it tomorrow. He's out painting old Kilcuddy's boat this moment." "Thanks," said Sweyn. "I appreciate it. How much do I owe you?" "Well, let's see what she needs to make her whole first, eh? Could be nothing more than a paint job. Could be a lot more. If it's more, we can help with that, and then we'll talk money." Sweyn agreed the job could get more complicated. He had no idea how Starry Sea had fared while he lay unconscious down below, but all the same, he would like to have had a fixed price for at least some of the services to be rendered. This smile and a handshake small-town business made him uncomfortable. But the old lady refused to set a price till she knew what would have to be done for his cutter, save to assure him, "You'll be pleased with the quality of the work and the size of the bill." Finally, he agreed to her terms. What choice was there, really? At least the cutter could begin receiving service immediately, unlike in busier ports where he might have to wait days or even weeks. The only problem was that, with the boat up on blocks as of tomorrow, he would have to find someplace else to sleep a bit sooner than he had planned. He asked where he could find a hotel. "Huh," she guffawed. "Like we'd be a big town with the lights and tourists and all, down there like Prince George. Laddie, you and that yacht down there in the pier, which sailed here last fall to pass the winter, represent the sum of our annual tourist industry. There's no hotel here, not even a cottage with a room to let. Our island's out of the way, and we like it that way." "Then what's a visitor to do?" he barked, nonplussed. "A question we don't have to tend to much. If you need, there are lots of woods round about, if you camp near the village, but not too near someone's land. I dinna think folk will be put out. Not saying as you have to bide me, but I would not sleep too deep in the woods. This is wild country, if you take my meaning." He grunted affirmation. Aylwin had told him about the woods. The locals believed them haunted. Despite that nonsense, it was certain that this far north, wolves, bear, and moose ran in them, making camping a hazard. In any case, he did not keep camping gear aboard Starry Sea, save what was contained in a small abandoned ship bag beside the life raft. And he couldn't see himself living in the forest like a wild man for the next several days, coming into town grubby as a hobo to tend the boat. And, for the love of God, who ever heard of a town without so much as a single bed and breakfast? Could this place actually be that cut off from the rest of the world? All these years he had thought Éowyn must have exaggerated that part, but it seemed she had not. He thanked the shopkeeper for her help, and said he would return the next morning to oversee the hauling of Starry Sea. When he stepped out from the musty shop, the clouds had almost entirely gone, and sunlight spilled abundantly from a lucid sky, but it did nothing to improve his spirits. In fact, it seemed the increasingly cheery weather mocked him and his predicament. In the back of his head he had been afraid things would turn out like this. Man by the Sea was as isolated and unaccustomed to visitors as Éowyn had said. Not in the habit of receiving travelers, it offered no accommodations. And once he had started tearing into his boat, things would get messy. Wires and pipe, electronic panels and bilge covers, and every cushion and tool on the boat would soon be scattered all over the sole and deck. And while he had first fooled himself into thinking he could get the repairs done and be out of here in a week, the truth was, when he faced it, that it would take his sailmaker at least a couple of weeks to fabricate and ship a new mainsail. And it would take at least that long to service his vessel. Just surveying her for damage would take the better part of several days. He could not possibly live on Starry Sea during the repairs, and camping was out of the question. But he was not without options. He looked up the road going north, the only road leading out of Man by the Sea. According to the stories Éowyn had told him, the cottage where she grew up lay that way, at the very end of the path, she had said. But just the thought of it gave him shivers. Could he bear to get that close to something that had been so close to Éowyn? She had been part of that place. There, memories would flit like wayward phantoms. They would haunt every hollow shadow. In the midst of so much of what had been her world, the presence of memory would overwhelm him. The flashbacks would come. The pleasant ones were hard enough to bear, but the dark ones would come too, forcing him to relive the scent of sea-borne fire, the terror of cloth shrouds, fists pounding in humid darkness. But his father would have demanded he face his fears, look them in the eye, and talk about them till they are meaningless. Vivisect what haunts you till it's powerless. That's what he would have told Sweyn. Except that Sweyn did not buy into his father's psychobabble anymore. Once he had. He had admired his father so much he had followed in his footsteps and become a psychologist himself. But now Sweyn had no respect at all for the profession. It didn't make grief any less real. It didn't drive regret away. Psychotherapy was witch doctor medicine, and Sweyn did not believe in superstitions. But the real dilemma lay in the fact that Sweyn could not accept Éowyn's death. How could he accept the loss of someone he loved more than life? How could anyone? Better to rail against it and suffer the consequences of denying reality than to dim her memory. However painful, he would never let Éowyn go. So he was torn. To accept her passing was to diminish her, yet the memory of her was tearing his soul apart, and the North Road epitomized his inner struggle. To walk that path, he must face the memories he struggled to keep, yet keep at a distance. And so he hesitated upon the path, fearing to go, fearing to stay. Yet for all his trepidation, deep within he knew he must go. There had been so much of his sad, wondrous wife he had not understood. 3 years is such a short time to get to know someone so remarkable and complex. If he went to the cottage, he might learn something more of her. He took a step toward the North Road. The world cantered horribly, sweat rose to his brow. He suddenly seemed to be floating, detaching from himself, an inner observer of a terrified man. "Breathe," he told himself shakily. "Breathe." He managed several deep and tremulous gulps of air. Slowly, as he regained his runaway feelings, the almost fit of panic passed. His father had been right in one thing. He must face his fears. Only so doing could he survive 2 weeks on the island. Only then could he take the North Road. And the truth was, he wanted to. He would never have come to this place willingly. Never. But now that he was here, he did want to go that way, if only for a little while, just long enough to take in where she had lived, and keep her a bit more alive within. Just to see if he could overcome his phobia, he took another step in that direction. It was like pressing into the cold north wind, like forcing a path through a thicket of thorns and brambles. His haunted mind held him back as much as his hungry heart pressed him on. An eternity later, he forced another step. Moving his feet felt like lifting ingots of lead. But he managed it, and soon after he managed another step, then another, and another. Each step was daunting, but he moved north nonetheless, and so doing proved to himself he could make himself go that way. It was a terrible and wonderful power, for he knew that passing that way might allow him to reflesh the desiccated bones of her memory. The possibility was alluring, yet dangerous, for the heartbreak of such memory had already driven him to the brink of complete breakdown. If he were to bring that much of Éowyn back into his head, how much of himself would be left? Perhaps his sanity would retreat once and for all to a waking vision of times gone by, a permanent flashback of when Éowyn was alive and well within him, riding the waves upon Cerulean. And why not, really? Alone and happy with his delusions? He could live with that, he decided. Enough for now. With a few practice steps he had just taken, he had proven to himself he could face going that way. His course was set, and once when decided upon a course he was not one to sway. Later tomorrow, after Starry Sea had been hauled and partially pulled apart, he would walk the North Road and discover what there was to discover, and see how much of himself remained afterward. He turned around and started back toward the heart of the village. The sense of relief was immediate. The coldness went. The staccato thudding of his heart calmed. He could breathe easier. But by the time he returned to his vessel, he had laid another plan. Tonight, after he had looked Starry Sea over, he was going to find a pub and drink himself stupid. One little bit at a time, he told himself. Just go slow. You can handle it. He returned to Starry Sea to find a young man waiting for him. The young man introduced himself as the chandler's boy. He had heard about Sweyn's mishap on the ocean and felt he should help him get his boat out of the water as soon as possible. "I would not feel right leaving an injured boat overnight to our luck," he told Sweyn in the island's sing-song brogue. So he had cut from his other job early to give this priority. The boy's name was Finn, a youth in his early 20s. He was stout and fair-haired and had the look of a person whose business was the sea, wiry muscles, taut skin, tanned and already crinkles of crow's feet around his eyes. He wore the homemade canvas trousers Sweyn was coming to learn were common among men by the sea males. Similar to jeans, they buttoned up front and were stitched with thick twine. Usually brown or tan in color, they appeared to be a bit rougher than the jeans so common among folk on the continent east. The youth seemed competent as he used a small launch to tow Starry Sea into the narrow berth where a massive harness was immersed in the water, and the lift, resembling a great cage on enormous tires, idled, waiting. Expertly, Finn brought Starry Sea to a complete stop over the submerged harness and secured the cutter in place. Then he climbed out and engaged the lift. It took 15 minutes to raise the 10-ton vessel out of the water. Sweyn, who had been hovering on the deck like a mother hen, climbed off as the deck came level with the walkway around the berth and turned to regard the operation. Despite the boy's youth, he was masterful, a real tradesman. Soon Starry Sea was up high and dry, and Finn was backing the lift away from the berth. They proceeded down a dirt road to the dry docks, and Sweyn walked out in front to direct passers-by. The lift moved at only a mile an hour, and often Sweyn had to slow his pace so as not to get too far ahead of it. When Finn finally got Starry Sea over a waiting cradle of joists and blocks, Sweyn made sure everything was correctly aligned and in order, then watched as Finn lowered her gently down. He went round quickly, snugging up the braces which kept Starry Sea from tipping over on her keel, for though she might have been a fine, well-balanced craft out on the water, here on land she was out of place and crippled. Once the sailboat was securely set, the boy unfastened the harness, bid farewell to Sweyn with a crisp two-fingered wave, and drove the lift back toward the chandler. Sweyn watched him leave for a minute. He respected that kid, he decided. He knew his stuff. When the lift turned a corner, Sweyn turned and faced his vessel. Her bottom paint was dirty and in places stained with algae or crusted with a few barnacles, but the hull appeared sound. There were no obvious signs that she had been breached. He breathed a sigh of relief. Hull damage could have taken the better part of the summer to repair, and while he might manage to make himself face a couple weeks in Man by the Sea, he could not bear a full season here, he knew. He climbed aboard and began a more thorough survey of the boat from the topside. It was then that he spotted two problems, one major, and one not so major but still requiring attention before he took to the water again. The anchor hardware on the bowsprit had suffered when the anchor went overboard during the storm. When the anchor had hit the water and pulled Starry Sea around, a stroke of luck which undoubtedly saved his life, tremendous pressure had been exerted on the road. The road had pulled so hard that a portion of the stainless steel fairlead had warped, and the metal plate bracing it had buckled so badly that the metal was partially torn, a jagged edge now exposed which could chew through the road. But that could easily be repaired. The more serious problem involved the mast. Without a scatter of sailcloth to obstruct his trained eye, he quickly discerned the mast boot, where the mast met the deck, was cracked. Without a fully functional mast boot, the mast would not sit firmly in place. If we were to raise sails under such conditions, vibrations would result that could crack the mast, or even the deck itself. The mast boot would require repair or replacement. Unless that could happen fast, it would mean even more time on this rock. But vessels like Starry Sea were no longer built. He could not simply order the part from a manufacturer. It would have to be custom fabricated, and that would be both time-consuming and expensive. He closed his eyes and clenched his fist till his knuckles were white and the crescents of his nails bit crimson into his palm. The mast was the drive shaft of a sailboat. With mast and mainsail busted, he was doubly crippled. The seaman felt as if his leg were broken. He reined in his thoughts and stuffed down his feelings, though it was like shoving hot lead into a pot of water. Within he sizzled and crackled till it seemed he must burst. But he went on with his inspection of Starry Sea, keeping notes on other little things he needed to do to get the vessel seaworthy again. Several hours later he had a list 87 items long, adding to it such things as rebedding a seacock and changing the zincs. Most of it was relatively minor things which could have waited, but he was a meticulous seaman, and men like him were why a 75-year-old wooden vessel like Starry Sea remained sound and beautiful after all these years. But then for him, Starry Sea was more than just a boat or a bit of maritime tradition. She was part of him, his key to the only oblivion that ever brought a semblance of peace to his soul, out among the wind and waves and stretching horizons. Besides, if he could get the custom work done soon, he need not remain in Man by the Sea all that long. The other items could be tended to at the next port. Perhaps he would reach for Alaska or Victoria and put in there to finish the projects. It was as good a plan as any. He pushed his hands into his pockets and pondered quitting for the day. Battling the storm on the sea and another storm in his heart had given him a beating, inside and out. It was time to rest, sort through his thoughts, and try to figure out, once again, how in hell he had come to be here. How could he simply have misplaced himself for the weeks it would have taken to sail thousands of miles? The questions ate relentlessly at him, and the answers presented by his psychological training frightened him. Fugue, amnesia, dissociative identity disorder. He could be coming to the depths of madness at last. Perhaps it had really been only a matter of time, preordained since the burning of Cerulean. Terrible thoughts requiring he give them consideration. Even so, if it had been a bit earlier in the day, he would have gone instead to the chandler and sought out a metal worker to start the mast boot project. But the sun was already westering, and the shadows were growing long. Man by the Sea was a sleepy village, and the folk called their nights early. Businesses were closing. He might as well call it quits now. Take that thinking time. Perhaps he would go below and get some dinner going. Or instead, he could go find that pub, eat something that wasn't dried and didn't come from a can, and slosh down a few cold ones. He had not yet made too much of a mess inside Starry Sea. Later he could stumble back and topple into his bunk in the forward stateroom. Or you could go there now, he thought. Don't procrastinate. It'll eat at you. You'll wake up in the dark wondering where she is and nightmares flashing in your eyes, nightmares that won't go away. He stood on the deck for a long time considering while the sun moved lower in the west. It was true, he knew. If he put it off, it would eat at him as at a raw wound all through the night. He'd be lucky to sleep at all, and he would need to be rested if he was to get the vessel taken care of tomorrow. Practicality forced his hand. He made his choice. He went below, packed a small duffel with a few things, got a set of keys he never thought he would need, and climbed off the grounded little ship. Taking a deep breath, he began the trek up the North Road. It took only minutes to leave the tiny village behind. Beyond it, spread out in the little valley, sleepy farms were scattered over gentle hills, each meadow divided from the next by wooden fences painted bright red or white. The spring snows had only recently melted and the grass was still golden, but sheep and the occasional pony contentedly grazed in the herbage. At the back of the meadows, near the line of the hardwood forest, gaily painted yet practical cottages of trimmed, squared logs sat in the shadows of the trees. They were steeply gabled with wood-shingled roofs, and tufts of grey smoke curled contentedly from chimneys of brookstone and mortar. It was an idyllic setting, and it disturbed Sweyn. Aside from the occasional cry of a raven or magpie, or the bleating of sheep, it was entirely quiet. There was no music of water on the hall, no howling of wind in the shrouds, no rustle of sails. The silent peace of the land was eerie to him, dangerous. It did not shield him from unwanted memories, and he found himself wishing he had visited that pub before leaving men by the sea. The villagers were nothing if not friendly folk, though curious might have been a better word for them. He had not walked 200 paces when a wagon, a horse-drawn wagon if you please, carrying a married couple in their mid-30s and several kids, stopped and the driver offered him a ride. He accepted, and the couple brought him up the road a little over a mile till they reached a small dirt path that led to their farm. Along the way, they admitted that seeing a stranger was a novelty for them. Very politely, they asked if Sweyn would tell them a little about himself. He had not felt like talking as the difficult minutes took him slowly north, but politeness demanded a reply. He told them he was a cruiser, a sea gypsy, and that he had quite literally been blown into their island by a storm. "Were you on your way to Alaska before that?" they wanted to know. He shrugged and nodded, for what else could he say? One moment I was sailing south of the equator, heading for the trade winds below Hawaii. The next thing I know, a storm is forcing me into your wretched coast? No, better to keep his madness and sullenness to himself if he were to be stuck on this rock a while. But he was relieved when, after 20 minutes, they said they had reached their farm. Sweyn bid them farewell, and they asked him where he was headed. "Dundoof Cottage," he shrugged. The couple looked at each other then, their expressions metamorphosing from open friendliness to something queer and unreadable. Even their pack of young sons, horse-playing and back, ceased their puppy dog tumbling on sacks of seed and gaped at him, faces coated in sweat and dust, blond locks burnished bronze by the low ruby sun. The moment was frozen in time, or at least into Sweyn's memory, but the spell was finally broken when the man turned to face him again and said, his brogue thicker even than that of the villagers, "You'll find no one at the laird's cottage. No one but old Coppin's been keeping the place since the lady left all these years ago." "Aye, 18 now and more," added the farm wife, whose hair was long and black and drizzled curls over her pale cheeks and half-screened her dark eyes. "She was little more than a girl then." Her husband turned back to her, nodding. "Aye, Fawn, that's the truth of it. 18.5 years now it's been, and sorry years at that, with no lady and no laird to tend the island or the cottage." The couple seemed to share some unspoken memory, and for just a single moment there was a sparkle in their eyes, but then their expressions grew wistful, and the lady said, as if to herself, "A sad story, that." The man nodded. Sweyn wondered if somehow they had heard of Eowyn's death, but the man turned again to face Sweyn and said, "Coppin's a shrewd one, if a bit odd, but he's kept the place well enough, best as any one man can, I suppose, though he never goes off the grounds, you know. Never to town or the pub, or even to Cayley's, which I've always thought was passing queer. Terrible lonely way to live." Long ago, while telling Sweyn tales of the strange cottage where she had grown up, Eowyn had mentioned Coppin. Apparently he was some kind of caretaker, a bit of a butler, a bit of a groundskeeper. Sweyn was surprised to learn he continued to dwell at the old house, it being deserted so many years. But then Eowyn had said he was very old and had been there as long as she could remember. Perhaps the place was as much home to him as it had been to her. The woman, whose name may have been Fawn, or it may have been a term of endearment, said to Sweyn, "You'll be visiting Coppin then? Never heard tell him having any kin? Any at all?" "No, not quite visiting," Sweyn told her. "The place is mine." This brought a different and completely unexpected reaction from the couple and the boys in back. The color blanched from the adults' faces. The youths, who had been quietly jostling for a better vantage of the stranger, became still as stone. "Do you tell me that now?" said the husband then. His voice had gone low and soft. "You'll be the new laird then?" "Just visiting," said Sweyn. "That's all. Just passing through." He could see countless questions brimming in their eyes, but the last thing he wanted to do was talk, least of all about the circumstances of his inheritance, so he waved, turned briskly, and started up the north road again. After a minute he heard the clopping of the horses' hooves, the creak of the wagon wheels turning. Glancing back, he saw the wagon rolling down the long path through the meadow toward the farmhouse and breathed a sigh of relief. Shortly, the paving gave way to gravel, and another mile later gravel gave way to dirt, still tacky from the recent thaw of winter snow. He trudged ahead, ignoring the mud clinging to his boots, slowly passing other gaily painted farmhouses, but he never gave them a glance. He was lost in thought, for something they had said aided him as he went. They referred to the last resident of the cottage as the Lady, which could only have been Eowyn, for her mother had died when she was a child, and her younger sister only a few years after, leaving Eowyn as the last O Shee to dwell there. But Lady was an awfully grand term. He knew the O'Shees had held some wealth, but had they been so prominent on the island? If so, Eowyn had never mentioned it. He puckered his lips and blew out a perplexed sigh as he tried to make sense of it. Wealth usually indicated influence. His best guess was that maybe, long ago, the O'Shees had been influential, maybe even something like petty nobles. The people of the island were very traditional. Perhaps they still referred to the O'Shees with titles out of habit. The shadows lengthened as he walked, and the sky grew magenta, then amethyst as it deepened into twilight. Around him songbirds crooned the evening chorus. Ravens and magpies picked the remnant seed of last year's harvest from fields recently freed of snow. Abruptly, he passed the last farm, and then there were only a few compact cottages scattered along the last mile of road in thickening woods, each with a curling tuft of smoke drifting over a chimney of uncut brookstone. Some of the cottages were built of cut lumber whitewashed with colorful trim of green and gold. Steep gables were a ubiquitous quality of the local architecture. But as he moved deeper into the forest, the construction of the cottages changed. Instead of painted lumber, the walls were plastered and steeply pitched roofs were thatched, though tarps hung from them in places. The tarps had been used to protect the thatch through the winter, keeping it from becoming waterlogged beneath British Columbia's sticky, damp snow. But Sweyn kept his eyes on his feet as he walked, his hands stuffed deeply in his pockets, paying no heed at all to the charming cottages or natural beauty. The statements of the farm family continued to nag at him. He knew there were things about Eowyn she had avoided speaking of. It had never bothered him till now. When people lose loved ones, the image they keep in their hearts of the deceased becomes an ideal, precious and irreproachable, but not quite real. But confronting the possibility that his wife had kept secrets from him gave him cause to wonder what might be left of that image after he fleshed out her memory. "Turn back," an inner voice warned. That was fear. It emerged quiet but strong from a dark, unwholesome place deep within. But he determined that nothing could make him love Eowyn any less. Her past was past, and he would cherish the 3 short years he had had with her regardless of whatever he might discover. So in answer to the inner voice, he pressed on. This was a healing step for Sweyn, a decision of courage he had not possessed the resources to make only yesterday. As he neared the farther end of the little valley, the dirt path began to wind this way and that, weaving through thick stands of towering hardwoods that looked as if they had stood for century upon century. In the forest, evening shadows engulfed him. Animal sounds and movements of unknown shapes ghosted through the darkness gathering beneath massive boughs. But as Sweyn went, he only looked to the earth just before his feet, unmoved by the beauty or the mystery of the nightwood. One can dodge the future, but only for so long. One can walk the lonely path through the deep wildwood where no other folk are found, but eventually the future will be found. And it does no matter if the path forks left or right, or one turns round and goes back again. The future is such a beast as cannot be evaded. It is always the destination, no matter where you turn. Eowyn had written that not long before she died. Sweyn had come across it as he packed away her journals after the funeral. It was tucked into an entry made only a couple months before the end. More and more in those days, he had found her looking out the chalet north and west over the sea, in the direction he knew of her island. She never spoke of it. He never asked her. Talk of home was hard for both of them, but he could tell something was growing on her mind. Some waxing darkness, some pull toward the place of her origin. No ferries from the mainland passed that way. No planes flew to the island. But if she wanted to return to Man by the Sea for any reason, all she had to do was ask. He would take her there himself. He was confident she would speak the wish to him if the time came. The memory of that was on his mind when he reached a point where the path ended abruptly at a wooden gate. Once whitewashed, but now the old paint was faded, in places flaking and crumbling away, the wood underneath dark and half rotted from neglect and the frequent rains along the coast. His eyes were drawn up the line of the canted planks of the gate to the hill beyond. The hill suffered a scattering of shrubbery which had once been ornamental, but now had gone wild and spread chaotically, so that now the foliage seemed to be frozen, in the act of exploding over the ground. Tendrils drooping from bushy branches and shoots from woody runners, the once elegant shrubs now devoured the yard. Here and there was a smattering of oaks and blackthorns and rowans, dark arboreal silhouettes against the twilight. absolutely still in the calm air. Their boughs spread out over the places not occupied by the aggressive shrubs, and even the smaller blackthorns seemed to guard the grounds protectively, brooding and watchful. In the spaces between shrub and tree, sweet calf-high grass grew, jade in the wan light. The path beyond the gate was demarcated by uncut stepping stones laid down long ago with such skill that each seemed to fit a groove prepared for it by the other stones. So precise was their situation that no weeds grew up between them, and the path they marked wound and twisted its way to the summit of the broad hill, where it crashed into the great hulking dark truth of Dundoof Cottage. He stood quietly, awed and frozen by the sight, and he thought, "Eowyn, why did you never tell me?" But there was no answer, not even the ghostly voice of distant memory. Yet if a ghost should dwell anywhere but a dilapidated graveyard, then this surely must be the place. It was a fey place, a lonely place, and it reminded him of ancient dreams too misty and cobwebbed to fully recall, of childhood tales meant to send frisons up and down the spine. Perhaps, had he been another man, one not so direly numbed by life, he might have felt wonder at the sight of Dundoof Cottage, but now, as he looked upon the great, dark vastness of it, he felt only bewilderment, for no cottage was Dundoof Cottage. Keep would be more apt. Lair, even. It was massive. In size, it could only be compared to an English manor, and a great one at that. A main structure that appeared to be 100 paces across and 3 stories high was the central feature. On the first floor of the main structure, tall windows with rounded arches and deep overhangs predominated. But the windows were irregularly spaced, as if a blind architect had thrown darts at the wall and said, "Cut here." One window might be 10 feet from its neighbor, but the one after it only a yard, and then nothing but stone for 20 paces. The windows were plate glass and all were dark, with heavy curtains behind them guaranteeing concealment of whatever lurked within. The second floor's windows were bizarre round affairs, perhaps 3 feet in diameter. The third floor appeared to have no windows at all, but narrow slits like those found in medieval castles for archers fighting a siege. A parapet surmounted the flat roof of the main structure, and battlements were set along it. The walls were built of an odd mix of timbers and great dark uncut stones which, like the stones of the path, were fitted together expertly amidst the timber. Dundoof Cottage had been expanded north and south. On the south side was an addition built of massive square-cut rough timbers laid horizontally. Rectangular windows of traditional design were spaced regularly along the walls, but the windows were the limit of the structure's normalcy. The addition was a full 3 stories tall. The wood was pale, as if it had not been painted. Perhaps it was stained, or only treated against rot. A great door, at least 20 feet high and round above, was set into the middle of the first floor of the addition. A balcony wrapped around the entire second story, providing shelter for a porch that surrounded the entire first story. Antiquated furniture was scattered up and down the porch and balcony, showing that once, in happier days, residents of the house had spent much time out of doors, taking their ease in the fresh air at the garden's edge. The balcony was protected by elegantly carved wooden rails, and though the wood had darkened and suffered for lack of attention over the years, the roof over the third story was steeply arched and extended far out, providing cover over the balcony. Flying buttresses leaned against the walls of the structure, and tree-shaped stone pillars supported the overhang of the roof. Several uncut stone chimneys rose from this addition, emerging from the roof like stalagmites, and around the outer edge of the roof were statues of strange creatures carved of pale stone. Some were hideous willowy beings with cunning faces. Some were magnificent horses with flowing manes. Some were tall, slender, nude maidens with mischievous but not unkind eyes. Other creatures there were too, such as could hardly be described, like clouds with faces, and toadstools with eyes, and even images of ordinary seals. But the extension on the north side of Dundoof Cottage was the most bizarre of all, a great round tower made of stone. The first story met the base of the structure, fully as wide in diameter as the main house was long. The story was built of carved local stone, the blocks immense and strong. A dark mortar, the color of elderberries, was worked in between those places where the masonry was slightly less than perfect, but those places were few. In most places, the stones had been joined so expertly it seemed nothing more than their weight was needed to fit them together. No windows were visible in this part of the tower. The second story was similar to the first in construction, though not quite half its diameter, so that it was not physically attached to the main house. It was set off center of the first story, and deep, wide windows were placed around its circumference, curtained with heavy crimson. In the fading light, the windows looked out over the grounds like searching eyes, and seemed to contain eldritch secrets beyond the ruby irises. The third story was again a third smaller than the second level, perhaps 30 paces wide. Shuttered windows, slendered and high like arrow slits, marked it. The fourth story of the tower marked the highest part of the house, and it was also the most bizarre, for it was nothing like any structure that should by rights be attached to a house. Great carved blocks of stone stood on end around the circumference of it, 9 in all. The stones were dark shadows against the deepening sky. Each stone stood a dozen feet tall, perhaps 3 broad. Each must have weighed many tons. Wide gaps were opened between the standing stones. Over some, but not all, horizontal slabs had been laid. There were 5 such slabs, 2 touching each other, the rest scattered around the odd structure as if haphazardly, forming a broken roof. Years before, Sweyn had seen the famous Stonehenge while sailing up and down Great Britain, and this structure was clearly reminiscent of it. But this henge was certainly no replica, for not only was it built at the top of a tower, but a great standing stone was erected at the center of it. The central stone was rounded, perhaps a yard in diameter. Black it was, like the spaces between the stars, and it seemed to possess a luminous fire at its heart. It was as if ruby flame had been frozen with an obsidian. He stood motionless at the gate, breath stolen, eyes riveted. A chill not derived of cold possessed him. His skin prickled. Things whispered to him in the darkness of the path, ghosts of memories flittering, bearing warnings in faded voices, and the warnings all brought to bear the same chilling message. His memories of Eowyn were but bones. In their 3 years together he had thought he had known her so completely, but he had been wrong. She had held tight to secrets unspoken, unfathomed, and when the wind blew out of the northwest, bearing the fragrance of the sea, she grew quiet and dark, and her secrets brought her sorrow. He had thought perhaps she had escaped an abusive upbringing, or simply could not let go the place where she had buried her mother and sister. But whatever the real truth was, it was far stranger, and she had kept it to herself except for one time, and one time only, when she had almost opened. Only one time. Don't go there, aside of himself warned. But it was too late. It was much too late. The great obscene presence of Dunduve Cottage stood like a well of shadow against the brink of night, and its very existence demanded he look beyond the mirage he had thought was Eowyn. Whatever she was, wherever she had come from, her story was far deeper than he had ever suspected, and if he should turn his back upon the questions raised by the sight of her monstrous home, he must face a lifelong knowledge that he had never known the woman he loved and lost, and spent his days pining for. A sad fate to waste away only for a shadow. Whatever the consequence, fate had brought him to reckon with the truth of Eowyn. The dam was breached, and memory overflowed. He seized a gatepost, squeezed till splinters pierced his hand, a last desperate ploy to ground himself in the moment. It failed. His mind tumbled back 5 years to a night in Glacier Falls when Eowyn was with him, and the mere act of living didn't hurt. The chalet was quiet, and only the chirruping of crickets and the lonely call of an owl were borne upon the night air. A warm evening breeze soughed through the boughs of fir and cedar. It came from over the sea and bore the tang of brine through the open windows, past gently rustling cream-hued curtains. It also picked up the scent of Eowyn's herb garden, dozens upon dozens of varieties of flowers and weeds and ferns gathered from the forest, some of which she used for medicine, some to spice food, and some for blending her extraordinary teas. They sat in the dim light of a single candle, side by side, bodies touching in the easy way of companions who are long close and comfortable. They had been quiet, sipping infusions of rowanberry and chamomile blossom, birch twigs and bluebells. The tea was naturally sweet and tasted of flowers and brought a sensation of calm. It made him think of soft feather beds and the steady rhythm of grandfather clocks. Sweyn eased his large hand over Eowyn's small, delicate fingers, and she leaned her head on his shoulder. Her hair was red flame, shoulder-length and curly, cut just past her shoulders, and the silken touch of it on the skin of her neck was like the brush of butterfly wings. They had been talking, making lovers' plans, long, peaceful lives, children, work, dreams and desires. They spun their hopes together like a net, and meant to catch only a bit of happiness for themselves. Sweyn wanted to make a new start of his life, doing something he loved. He wanted to take to the sea for a living, buy a sailboat for pleasure charters, and to teach others how to harness the wind and ride the waves. He could see no better way to spend his days than upon turquoise waters beneath a warm sun, coming home to his lady by night and sharing all the moments in between. For her part, Eowyn wanted to do something with the herb she loved so much, and Sweyn had encouraged her to pursue her passion and start a tea shop. Her infusions were nothing short of magical. They could freshen one in the morning without caffeine and relax at the end of the day without tranquilizers. He had no doubt that anyone who tried her tea blends would become a regular customer. Sitting next to her, he recalled when he had first met her in a used bookstore in the San Juan Islands a year before. She had seemed fragile and shy, and more than a bit out of place. Between her brogue and her fey manner, she had the air of a damsel of old thrust into a much jaded era. But as he had come to know her, he had learned she was neither fragile nor shy. She possessed an inner fire. Her delicateness was like that of a woodland doe, full of vigor and gentle strength. He was powerfully drawn to her from the very first. She possessed a sense of wonder and centeredness that he desperately needed, and she was willing to share. But he could never really understand what she saw in him. When she encountered him, he was only a wandering seaman living on starry sea. Once he had been a doctor of psychology, but he had become disillusioned with that career. He no longer believed in it at all. Now he was a man in his mid-30s in a sort of identity crisis, unable to determine his goals or his center. He had asked her once, after they had been seeing each other for 2 weeks, what on earth did she see in him? She had laughed and said she liked men who smelled of the sea. That was good enough for him. He would not test fortune by asking for any more reason than that. So now they sat on the couch by the light of a single candle, fragrances of herbs and sea mingling in the dark, weaving their dreams round one another till even the owls slept. The deep quiet of the wee hours stole through the forest, and the candle flame flickered in a pool of molten wax. They too fell silent with the night, and for a long time the only language that passed between them was through the touch they shared. But she looked often to the window from which the breeze blew in out of the northwest, and at last he asked softly if she would tell him of her home. She was quiet so long after the question, her breathing smooth and deep and rhythmic, that he thought she had drifted off. Gently he put his arm around her shoulders and kissed her fiery hair, pondering whether to go get her a sheet and leave her to sleep on the couch, or carry her to bed. Her voice came then like the tremulous sigh of a faltering breeze, breathy like the half-blown note of a flute. "It's a part of me best forgotten." She spoke it like a wish. Sweyn kissed her brow. His voice was deep and fluid as the ocean. "If you can't go there, I understand. I would like to know you, is all. It's so much a part of you, and I don't understand it at all." She looked slowly up into his eyes. They were jade and grey, like the sea before the coming of a storm when clouds scuttle low over it. Aylwin was always drawn by Sweyn's eyes, for they, like everything else about him, spoke of the sea. He was a man, sure enough, but the spirit of the sea was within him. It might be more correct to say he was an elemental, and belonged to water more than he belonged upon it. He regarded her patiently. If she remained silent, she knew he would say nothing, but in truth all he wanted was to know her better, and so she bid back her good sense and told him a little, just a little. He could never understand her world, but this man, who had thrown his whole life and lot in with her, he deserved something. So she began. "When I was young, I grew up in a very big house, though we weren't exactly well-to-do. It was called Dundoof Cottage. The name means the Black Keep, and the reason for it is unknown to me. Lost in history, perhaps, or maybe it's kept in the journals of my ancestors. It was an unusual place, but I was happy there. I had a mother and a father, and a sister 6 years younger. Everything was perfect, but then I lost my da, and then my mum, and then nothing was right again after that." "Your parents died?" he asked. "Eowyn, I'm so sorry, I didn't know." She shook her head. Her slight form seemed to grow smaller. She shivered. "My da left us. My mother died of a broken heart. I thought it would be just my sister and myself then. I was old enough to take care of us by then, but then—" she hesitated. "Then I lost my sister too, to the forest. There was nothing left except bitter memories, so I left soon after. But it didn't go peacefully. I despised Dundoof Cottage and the wood all around. It had taken everyone I loved. I hated it so much I might have burned it to the ground. I went to live in Man by the Sea for a time, but it was too full of ancient traditions that tugged at me, for all our folk are drawn in our hearts to the old ways. But I didn't want the old ways any longer, so I left the island altogether. I came here. The years passed. I found you." She fell silent. Her eyes were round and sad and full of unspoken things. It was only a little what she had said, and he was hungry to know more. But talking even this much about it had been hard for her. He did not have the heart to press for more. There was time. He would go gently, till she was ready to talk of it in her own good time. For Eowyn, he could wait a lifetime. But he did not know then just how little time they had. Horror has a way of sweeping upon one so fast, out of nowhere, in the least expected moment. And then, in the beat of a heart, the flashback was over. It wasn't an unpleasant flashback this time, but nonetheless, it left him short of breath, heart thudding, feeling like he had been drowning. He gasped for air and clung to the gate till the world ceased to wobble. His knees steadied. Oh, how he wished for the waves, for a sail full of wind and his craft beating against it at a heady heel beneath the stars. But such balm was beyond his grasp. Starry Sea was grounded, and he was landbound, with none of the things he cherished to soothe his soul. Around him, the air still smelled of hardwood forest and the giddy life of a new spring, but the salt sea was in it too. It was a small island, and he could faintly detect the sea at the fringes of his senses. It was one small, precious thing he could cling to, and slowly he calmed, centered himself. He breathed deep, let the air free in a quivering sigh. At least the memories had not taken him to a worse place, to a night of fire and screams and white shrouds. He regarded the gate as if it were dangerous, then pushed it. Tired, rusty springs wailed a pitiful protest, and then he stepped onto the grounds of Dundoof Cottage, the legacy left him by Éowyn. It was an inheritance he would have as soon never seen, would have sold long ago but for a promise. It seemed when he stepped across the threshold the night held its breath, the crickets ceased their chorus, the night birds their symphony. For an instant, only an instant, the leaves did not even rustle with the new spring breeze just beginning to build in the south. The only sound there was in that instant came low from the north, where a grove of aged apple trees descended from the cottage right down to the crumbled wooden fence that demarcated the boundary between grounds and woods. It was the sound of steps lightly taken. He turned slowly, expecting perhaps a deer mincing beneath the boughs. What met his eyes was a pale figure wearing a gown of white. Half concealed in shadow, the form was unmistakably feminine, even though it was illuminated only by the light of spring stars. The woman passed beneath aged apple trees, budding tender new leaves. She ghosted from trunk to trunk, flowing as she went in the liquid way of a dancer. And then she began to sing as she went, the notes sounding as if they spilled from a flute of crystal. His ears caught the lyrics. In green glens where flower, herbs of bluebell and shrubs of rose, the lady in her summer bower suffers ne'er when the cold wind blows. The lady in her summer bower, where a wild wood of black oak grows, conducts from her vasty tower the land no chill zephyr knows. So luminous is her estival dower, many a courting laird comes from afar. But Ellidurydd in her summer bower bides but summer breath and summer star. Her voice was delicate and breathy, like the plaint of the wooden flutes of Ireland. The tune she sang wove up and down, spanning 2 octaves, and the key was such as he had never heard before. The notes fit no scale of Western music, some seeming to land just beneath where C should be, some well beyond A, yet others fell precisely into place, familiar B's and G's and bittersweet F's. The melody was the most beautiful he had ever heard, and it made his heart ache to hear it, though the girl was distant, the strains of her song coming to him like pollen drifting on a summer's breath. But the music called to him, and he took a single step off the path only to hear better. All he could see of her in the starlight was a gauzy gown of white contrasting hair black as the night itself, spilling over a willowy frame. And then she too seemed to become aware of his presence, for she froze like a doe caught in a spill of light, and he swore he saw her eyes glow, just as a doe's might have, and she turned and fled into the darkness of the trees, gliding over the ground as smoothly as a boat slips over glassy waters, with no other sound but the brief rustle of fabric over leaf fall. And then she was gone, and it was dark, and the crickets fiddled and the night birds composed, and he stood alone and lonely, a shattered man in the many shades of twilight, with a moment of perfect stillness ended. The tune echoed in his mind, bits of pieces, scintillating like dust of shattered diamond, but with the damsel's passing he could not wrap his mind around the whole of it. Only fragments of the lyrics remained, emblazoned in his memory, a small salve for bittersweet recollections. He stared into the darkness where she had vanished, wondering who she had been. A servant girl from the cottage? He knew only of the old keeper, Coppin. A neighbor girl, strolling into the night? Maybe. But another thought flitted, unwanted, into his mind. Éowyn had once described her deceased sister to him, small and fair, hair like a raven's wing. But it could not be. Éowyn had said her sister was dead, and when Éowyn had passed away the deeds of the cottage had gone to him unchallenged. There were no other heirs. He considered pursuing the damsel to learn her identity, but the thought of chasing the girl through the darkness repelled him. It would frighten her, and he could not bear that. It was a small island. He would see her again, surely. He turned toward Dundoof Cottage, his unwanted house, shattered echoes of the girl's song flitting through his thoughts. And he feared, for deep down inside grew the certainty that his own dear Éowyn had not been the person he had believed, and there was more happening here than he could know. "Don't go there," the ghost of memory warned. He did not want to, but the eastern sky was whitening with the dawn, and reality fell apart. Chapter 3. A Manx, a Scot, for Seagod plots, down neath the greeny brino, lostling, foundling, past confounding, and o'er the salty winds blow. A nursery rhyme of the children of man by the sea. He sat in a comfortable, if aged, recliner in the south wing, the smaller wing of the great cottage, and the one which had the closest resemblance to an ordinary abode. The south wing turned out to be the only portion of the house still in use, the only inhabitant of its labyrinthine halls being the old caretaker, Coppin. The spring morning was chill, and the little old caretaker bustled about a broad round stone hearth that occupied the middle of the massive den. Walls, floor, and ceiling of the den were constructed of pale polished oak, ornamented with sculpted mouldings portraying images of acorns and hazelnuts, apples and salmon. The hearth itself was large, fit for a king's hall. Constructed of clay and naturally polished brookstone, it was a full 6 feet in diameter, but the fire Coppin had built to a side of the great metal bowl of it was diminutive, little more than a collection of twigs and fist-wide gnarled logs of fast-growing birch. The fire was so small compared to the vastness of the den that it seemed it should have no chance of warming the great room, yet it quickly took the edge off the morning chill. The old caretaker was hunched and frail, and as he worked, he muttered around a long, slender pipe tucked between wiry lips. When he puffed on the pipe, the room filled with the fragrance of mint and forest. The old eccentric was smoking sprigs of mint and herbs in a pipe that was as long as Sweyn's forearm. Coppin fussed with the kettle suspended over the fire by a cast-iron hook set into the mortar of the chimney. While he waited for the kettle to sing, he carved cavities into scones and laid them upon a silver tray. Then he used a tablespoon to stuff a tan-sweet cream and jam of local berries, bright and red, into the hollows of the scones. When the breakfast was all prepared, and the kettle whistling cheerily, he poured water into a teapot and dropped in a mesh ball packed with herbs harvested from the small, stone-enclosed garden behind the house. Sweyn was afraid to ask, but he was sure it was the herb garden where Eowyn used to play when she was a little girl, and later learned the herb lore she had applied to create her healing potions and teas. Indeed, the aroma coped from the steeping herbs was strongly reminiscent of one of her special blends. The fragrance was present, but some in memory so powerful it made him gag. Coppin brought the tray over to Sweyn and set it on a stool. The tea was amber, the scones golden vessels of jam and cream. He dabbled at a scone, the first food to cross his lips since the day before yesterday, but his hands were shaky and he could scarcely hold the scone. No matter, his appetite had fled and he could find no interest in the fine but simple fare. Too many things had happened all at once, and now that he had a moment to sit back and take stock, he found a whirlwind of impossibilities stalking his thoughts. Foremost was the nagging problem of how he had come to be here at all. His last clear and coherent reckoning was of floating just south of the equator, drifting idly in the doldrums. Then a wind, strange and cool, hailing out of the east and bearing the fragrance of a northern forest, had come up. He had raised his sails and veered north toward the equator, no other goal in mind than riding a crisp beam reach for a while. That had been weeks ago. And then came a blur of days and nights during which he continued to sail that beam wind on a starboard tack. But somehow he had turned slightly east and kept his tack, needing to do little else but sit at the helm for thousands of miles while he crossed weather zones where the wind should have blown from the opposite direction, forcing course changes and shifting sails. But the weather had never varied. The wind had held steadily off starboard at 15 knots all those weeks, so that even by night when he must have fallen asleep at the helm, something he had never done before in his life, the wind continued to propel him north, ever north, with a slight declination east, until he had been driven to the shore of this time-forgotten island by too much ill luck to believe only luck had been involved. As if that were not freakish enough, there were other things to eat at him. Along the entire way he had not thought to check his chart plotter or so much as take a bearing from the noonday sun. Without even a glance at the sextant and charts, it had been the equivalent of sailing with a blindfold on. Never in his life had he neglected proper navigation, yet in all those weeks it had never even occurred to him. The truth was that until yesterday he had no awareness of what he was doing or where he was going, and had not even given it a thought till the very moment he was almost aground on the island. Given that, the odds that he should have accidentally made landfall at the birthplace of his wife were laughable. The island of Manannan was a tiny, out-of-the-way crescent in the North Pacific, a needle in a sea of haystacks. Far more likely it was that he had unconsciously desired to come here and steered a course for the island. But even if he had acted unconsciously, what chance could he have had of reaching the island without actively navigating? You needed more than just a bearing to plot a boat's course. Ocean currents, wave action, and magnetic deviation would have led him hundreds of miles off course without frequent position fixes and course adjustments. But he knew he had done none of that. There had been no navigation marks on his charts, no calculations in his log. The chart plotter had even been off when he came back to himself. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how implausible it was that he should be here. It was like a nightmare he could not wake up from. He laid his head in his palms, rubbed his tired eyes, and tried to sort through his memories. He could recall bits and pieces, but it was all broken up and foggy, as if he had gone on a drunk the whole time, but not a drop had crossed his lips. There had been no liquor aboard Starry Sea in months. Even in depression he had never been much of a drinker. But at the moment he wished he were a drinker. It would be easier to add alcoholism to his list of problems than deal with the implications of his predicament, for only an insidious mental illness remained to explain it. It was conceivable that he had acted in fugue, set a course here, plotted it, and then threw his notes overboard in a fit of paranoia. He was mad in so many other ways already. Depression, flashbacks, violent mood swings. Fugue might not be far-fetched. Could he finally be tumbling over the edge? If it were fugue, was it only a matter of time before he descended irretrievably into psychosis? But a small part of him, less rational and cynical than the rest, could not believe madness brought him all the way here. His only clear memory was of mindlessly riding a beam wind through sunny day and starry night. It had been a perfect wind, an impossible wind, and his gut, if not his head, told him there was some intent in it. But that was ridiculous. He was a rational man, and the wind did not blow with reason. It followed the whims of sun and clouds and waves. It blew where it would by chance and nothing more. With an oath, he tossed the scone into the hearth. It shattered, and some of the crumbs tumbled into the fire where they sputtered into golden sparks. Coppin said nothing, only watched, his expression unfathomable. The island. The island. Aylwin had said strange happenings surrounded it. Was he just one more story in its convoluted myths? A mystery like this so-called cottage, part eyesore, part wonder? It was ensconced in the forest at the end of the valley, an obscene monument to where Aylwin had grown up, lost her family, and developed an enduring hatred of home. And now the place was his. The will had specified a large home in the wilderness. He had imagined some crumbling lodge recessed in the endless boreal forest of Canada, but this was no less than a lord's manor, and despite its weird architecture, the place exuded antiquity and brilliant tradition. It was easy to imagine candlelit halls where once regal balls had been held, and vaulted libraries holding lore and leather-bound tomes. It was just as easy to imagine sorcerers' laboratories sequestered behind hidden doors, and a torchlit dungeon rotting beneath the foundation. And the farm wife had asked him if he was the new laird, as if she were expecting a lord to bring back the cottage's former glory. He laughed and sighed at that. Laird? He was a burned-out psychologist who hated his profession, a widower who could not let his wife go, a gypsy who spread his bed upon the sea. In truth, he was only Sweyn the Lost, Sweyn the Mad. Yet still he could not believe mere madness had brought him here. Fugue or fool, there are all kinds of ways to be mad, a hateful inner voice chided. True. Yet it was not for fear of madness that he found himself sitting beside the hearth, not cold, but with hands trembling like aspen leaves in a zephyr. What really shook him now had happened only last night, if it had happened at all. What had seemed clear and sure in the dim hours of twilight now hung tenuously within his mind like a veil of mist, fading, fading. The way the irrational slips the grasp of an enlightened man, if only given time. But in the remnant of memory he recalled the dark-haired girl moving through the apple grove by the light of the first stars. In her white gown she had been only a pale, slender shadow, and it was her willowy form, beautiful but believable, that he still held most clearly within his mind. She had sung something, but he could not now recall the melody, only bittersweet fragments of lyrics. She stepped with liquid grace beneath arching boughs and seemed more ghost than girl. He watched her as if in a dream spun by the setting sun. A moment later, she had seen him and fled into the trees. He had watched her go, only a moment, then turned to make his way up the hill to the cottage, but where the sun had just gone down, now it was casting shafts of ruby over the eastern horizon. He had stood beneath the stars, the whole night through. Delusions, lost time. His mind was falling apart, and here was the surety of it. He had regarded a hallucination and stood frozen, like a catatonic schizophrenic, till dawn broke and he had staggered, dew-soaked, to the entrance of Dunduve Cottage, where his desperate rapping at the great south wing door had been answered by the desiccated form of ancient Coppin. Back in the moment, Coppin ordered, "Drink. Eat." His voice was as withered as his appearance, and it grated in the old man's throat. With trembling hands, Sweyn lifted the mug to his lips and sipped the tea. Yes, it was just like the infusions Eowyn used to make, but it was heartening and helped soothe his frayed nerves. You have the look of a man who has seen the fetch, Coppin observed. Sweyn blinked tired eyes, looked at the little man without comprehension. My pardon, said Coppin. You're not from these parts. A wraith, a spirit, a ghost. A ghost, Sweyn nodded. Perhaps I have at that. Perhaps I've seen too many ghosts. Ghosts have a way of draining away those who keep their eyes fixed upon them, the old man said in all seriousness, as if quoting some sacred token of folklore. Sweyn was not a superstitious man, but there was a lot of truth in what Coppin said, in a metaphysical way. Persons who could not let go the dead, they became like him. He took a deep breath and willed himself to calmness by thinking of the sea. No often these days do I get visitors to this broken house, Coppin said. Who is it comes knocking at Dundu's door? Sweyn took a sip of the tea, holding the mug in both hands, soaking the warmth into his dew-wet hands. I am Sweyn deSauld. Coppin sucked in his breath, a brief sound like the hiss of a roiling kettle. By the lady, he gasped between clenched teeth. You mean to tell me you're the laird? He narrowed his gaze on Sweyn, and it was not easy to see what thoughts flickered behind the slits of his bright blue eyes. Sweyn grimaced, and a single laugh spilled from him, mirthless. He put thoughts to voice. I was Eowyn's husband, that's all. She didn't want the estate, and neither do I. I haven't come to be your laird, whatever that involves. After a considerable pause, he added, Besides, there's more of her in these walls than I could bear. It was then, finally, that Coppin ceased his bustling, for till then he had been occupied with the comfort of his nameless guests. Good Celtic manners required no less than the best hospitality, but now he gave Sweyn his unbroken attention. She was a dear girl. I knew her well, and loved her well. She'd been like a daughter to me. Sweyn regarded him coldly. Eowyn's feelings toward the little man had been mixed, sometimes fond, often bitter. Because of it, the psychologist within Sweyn suspected the old man was a classic abuser, most of the time endearing but for tempests of vile temper and violence. Perhaps Coppin had simply been too firm a disciplinarian. Whatever the case, Sweyn was none too concerned for his feelings. It was only out of honor for Eowyn, who had had some regard for the little fellow, that he did not fire him on the spot and send him packing from the cottage. It's odd, said the old man, feeling still concealed between the blue slits of his eyes, that she never brought you home to visit. After all, I'd expect she'd have wanted you to meet the island folk and get to know the cottage. There was a none too veiled message in Coppin's statement. Why had Eowyn never presented him? But Sweyn, who had never been one to mince words, responded frankly. I expect she had every intention never to see this place again. She hated this place. He regarded Coppin directly, driving the next statement right at the old man. She hated everything here. Sweyn meant it to sting, but if it did, Coppin did not let it show. He merely continued to study Sweyn, his leathery face a cipher. As a psychologist, Sweyn had been trained for years in how to read people's every little gesture, every tick and nuance of behavior. He had even learned to decode the behaviors they were suppressing. But Coppin was a closed book, his inscrutability baffling. A silence descended over the room, betraying thickening feelings. A grandfather clock, tall as Sweyn, began to chime off 7 hours. Coppin turned upon the last chime, returned to the fire, and picked at it with a brass poker. I've been with the O'Shees all her days and longer, he said, as if speaking to the fire. I happen to know her heart was set on Dunduv once. It was as dear to her as sunlight to a flower. He set the poker down, threw in another twig of birch, hard and making sparks dash up the chimney, tracing whorls around curls of smoke. He added, as dear to her as this rare island. Sweyn shot up. There was more to say, to be sure. It burned in his breast like an ember aching to flare, a storm ready to burst. But he dared not say what was on his heart in this moment. If he should release that torrent now, he might not be able to restrain himself. Anger could surge. A flashback might come, or worse. So through clenched teeth he hissed, I'm off to find a room. Wake me at noon. So you'll just be staying on then? Coppin blurted, as if stunned at the guest's audacity at inviting himself. Indeed I will. For a little while. It's my house. He gathered his weary bones and set across the immense den, working his way toward a hallway lit only by the light of the sun spilling through an eastern window shrouded by curtains of heavy green. Let the old villain chew on that, he thought, as he made his way through the hallway, looking for stairs. It was only then that he realized he did not know where anything was in the enormous house. It took him some time to find a room that was even remotely suited for sleeping, on the second story, facing the rising sun, but it appeared more an abandoned artist studio, smelling of aged oil paint and old canvas. A plush couch was tucked into one corner of the vast chamber, a white sheet having been thrown over it long ago. The sheet was gray with dust. Without bothering to toss the sheet aside, he collapsed upon it, his solid frame causing the couch to creak beneath his weight. But before the springs had ceased their plaint, he was slumbering. After he was asleep, the door slipped quietly open, and slits of blue eyes regarded him. Untold thoughts swam in those eyes, but the face they were set in was no longer impassive. Yet the intent in the expression was lost in a muddle of wrinkles and leathery skin that did not seem to fit over the skull quite right. It might have been bitterness in that face. It might have been suspicion. It might even have been something brighter. Maybe it was a bit of all. The morning shadows shortened, and the door softly clicked shut, leaving the sleeper alone with unquiet dreams. Coppin crept down the hall, tending the O'Shee's cottage, as he had done for ages. Time passed on the island like the torpid waters on the outside bends of twisting streams. In those places, the water runs deep and slow, and lazy eddies spiral along the outer bank, in no rush to go anywhere. All the while, the water on the inner bank flows briskly over hectic shallows, racing downstream to lose itself in an unknown ocean. The island was just like that, out of the flow, in some lackadaisical eddy. Ignoring the headlong rush of the rest of the world, the island spiraled endlessly around where it had been, content with the time-proving good things of the past. The fishermen fished, the farmers harvested, wood made good heat, and clay and logs good shelter. And no machine was ever needed to do what a good strong back and a hard day's work could accomplish all the same. So the island folk held dear to what they knew, and the rush of the world across the sea passed them unnoticed. Some might have called the island's time patient, or even stayed, but to Sweyn it was only backward, and he proudly stayed impatiently while he waited for the shipments of the materials he required to repair Starry Sea. His sailmaker had informed him it would take 4 weeks to get his new mainsail, 2 weeks to complete the order, 2 weeks to ship it, for it had to come by sea. And to make sure he never faced such a dilemma again, Sweyn ordered a spare set of all 3 of his cutter's sails, an extra trysail for storms, as well as a light gennaker to back up his previous spinnaker, which had grown quite weary from years of the harsh sun of the tropics. The mast boot was a matter for a crafty metalsmith, but fortunately Man by the Sea had several, what with the need to maintain plowshares and fishwares and the like. In fact, the young man from the Chandler was a decent metal worker, and Sweyn had contracted him to fashion a new boot of aluminum using the old fractured one as a model. The job required complex cutting and shaping, and the youth had previous commitments, but he promised to have it ready by the time the sails arrived. The real problem arose when Sweyn returned to Starry Sea, which turned out to be a day later than he had planned, for he had slept through the first day at Dundoof Cottage, and discovered there was other damage overlooked in his first tired survey of the vessel. Several timbers halfway between keel and waterline had separated slightly under stress, but the damage was disguised by a crusty growth of barnacles. He found the damage while sanding the bottom in preparation for a new coat of bottom paint, and cursed as only a sailor can when he saw it. The clear cause of it was the anchor. When it broke loose of the bowsprit and first hit the water, it had banged viciously into the hull on its way down, gouging and tearing at the thick oak timbers. This was just the kind of damage he had feared, but he knew he was lucky the damage had not been worse. It could have sunk Starry Sea. Now it was clear. Starry Sea was beached well and true. To repair this damage he would have to find suitable timber, cut it to shape, mold it with steam, and fit it precisely to the hull where the old timbers had been. He had the skills to do such work himself, but it would take time, and to pull it off, he first had to see if the tools he needed could be found back at the cottage. It was doubtful they all would be there. He would need to order some. Later that evening he did find many tools in the cottage's carpentry workshop, but there was nothing for steaming large hardwood planks. That was to be expected. The next day in Man by the Sea, Dundoof Cottage had no phone. He ordered what he would need to fashion a steamer. The equipment itself would take several weeks to arrive, and he could not begin molding the timbers to the hull until it did. There was nothing to do but settle in and pass the time, a chore that would not have been half so difficult had the villagers not taken to calling him the laird. He made it clear he wasn't, but they persisted despite his protestations. It frustrated him to no end. They spoke deferentially to him and showed him favor whenever he was among them. Yet when he turned away, he could feel their stares and hear their whispering. He was the outsider heir of the house of the O'Shees, the laird who was not of their number. He may well have been the first outsider to reside in the cottage since the original inhabitants first settled, long before Canada was even a nation. In response to their attention, he showed only indifference. If they wanted to believe him their aristocratic alien, so be it. Neither their traditions nor rustic suspicions were his problems. He merely wanted to carry on day to day, surviving the memories Dundoof Cottage thrust upon him while getting Starry Sea ship-shape. When she was repaired, he would depart the little island of Manannan and leave the people whatever fond memories or resentments they chose to keep of him. It was all the same to him. He only wanted the sea and its promise of oblivion. It was on the 16th day on the island that he found himself at the shipyard where Starry Sea and a smaller 30-foot fishing trawler stood on cradles of broad wooden beams supported at the side by stout poles. Starry Sea rested soundly on her heavy full keel, making her stand significantly taller than the almost keelless, squat trawler. With nothing else to do and aching to keep his hands busy, Sweyn had spent the day sanding away the brightwork on her deck and polishing her fittings, even the hefty sailing winches that sat port and starboard of the binnacle, which he used to control the genoa and spinnaker. The sun was going down and nearly all of the old varnish around the cockpit was sanded to the point where bare, bright teak could be seen underneath. He sat up, basking in the satisfaction of sore muscles, which comes only after a hard day's work. He stretched luxuriously and dropped the worn sandpaper into a 5-gallon bucket at his feet, which he was using at the moment for a garbage pail. It was only then that he noticed the unusual quiet that had fallen upon the streets of Man by the Sea. Down in the salon, the Weems and Plath Atlantis clock, an elegant gift from Aylwin on their second anniversary, struck 4 bells, 6 o'clock. Around this time of day, the village shops tended to just be closing, and the streets were bustling, as much as they could bustle in a small village of 600 souls, with shopkeepers and their families, and smiling farm wives and their children, all heading home for the day. But today the village was quiet. It was May the 1st, and as the sun drew near the horizon, a sense of expectancy hung in the air, which had grown chill though the sky remained clear. He reached over for a hand towel lying on the starboard bench and wiped sweat from his brow. He smelled of old teak and sweat in the clean sea, an aroma that was pleasant or unpleasant depending on one's perspective. He remembered Aylwin's fondness for his Meritor's musk and did not bother to go below for a shower. Rather, curiosity drew him from the deck and he climbed onto the transom, then down a stepladder past the enormous rudder trailing behind the keel. He stepped onto solid earth and made his way into the heart of the village, wondering where all the people were. He passed several lanes of cozy cottages, some made of stone and some of squared and plastered logs, all whitewashed with colorful trim, till he reached a grassy area just south of the main business area. There was a smell like beer on the air, but different, and that was his first hint that there were, indeed, folk about, somewhere. Then, from further down the street, he heard a growing chorus of children's voices, singing, their lyrics sprinkled with giggles and impish bursts of laughter. As they drew nearer, he could hear their many steps, marching up the empty lane, and the occasional scatter of running feet accompanied by shouts of fright and glee. He took several paces more down the road till he caught sight of the village's children around a corner. They were all there, toddlers who could barely walk, supported by older brothers and sisters holding their hands, young lads and lasses nearly adult who pranced and glided among the little folk, the girls elegant blossoms in snug gowns of wool, the boys sleek in tight leggings with green leather jerkins. They weaved to and fro among the smaller children, dancing to the tune of a piper, a drummer on a bodhrán, and a skipping fellow playing a tiny harp held in one arm. The musicians were adults all, though their faces could not be seen for masks carved of hardwood. The masks were of beasts of the forest and the hunt, the bodhrán player a stag, the harper a hound, and the lithe female piper a swan. They led the procession of running children and skipping dancing adolescents up the main street in his direction, and between them wove another figure, so tall he must have stood on stilts, though his cavorting was fluid and so expert it could not be told. He wore no shirt, and his abdomen was hairy and tightly muscled so that he resembled some great wild man of yesteryear. Skins of moose he wore around his calves, fastened with leather thongs, and a loincloth covered his waist and groin. Epaulettes of thick deer's fur covered either shoulder, giving his muscular form an even more imposing appearance, and vambraces of boiled hard leather added to the effect of a wild beast man of the wood. But upon his head was the masterpiece of the costume. A crown of dark, shiny holly leaves and crimson, jewel-bright berries concealed a headdress that supported great stag's horns which rose like boughs of trees from either side of his brow. The horns must have been incredibly heavy, yet the dancing man weaved lightly beneath them. So smoothly it appeared he wore no costume nor skipped on stilts. He pranced and danced up the street as merrily as the gambolling adolescents. As they came, the horn man leapt from one side of the road to the other, apparently picking houses and shops at random. As he approached a building, the small children flowed around him like a tide and rapped on doors and windows, shouting, "Acorns for the Horned Lord!" And at each door, after a hesitant moment, adults peered out in mock surprise and worry, and quickly poured handfuls of small, round pellets into the waiting hands of the children. Some apparently were edible, and these the children gobbled down. The rest were pocketed or given by the little ones to the dancing teens, while the whole grand procession proceeded up the street in his direction. A door opened at his side, the entry into a whitewashed tavern of stone and mortar. A pair of large smiling men and a small giggling woman stood in the doorway. One of the men held up a cool glass of some dark wort as if waving, and said, If you dinna get out to the road, they'll be accosting you for the Horn Lord's luck, and I doubts a stranger such as yourself would have the token to get but the bad." With friendly gestures, they urged him into the tavern. It was not at all like a seedy pub the likes of which he might have encountered on the mainland. Sure, this tavern held its share of pipe smoke, but the fragrance was clean, minty, like the ever-present cloud of herb smoke which clung around Coppin, and the scent of ale was somehow wholesome, like home-baked bread. Someone pressed a mug into his hand. The woman, who appeared in her middle 20s, was all smiling eyes and red curls, clapped her mug to his with a hearty, "Beots ye na luck." Then she tipped the wort and took a long, deep swig. The men watched him expectantly. He hesitated, but not wanting to offend the locals, tipped his back too. What he tasted was not bitter, nor dry, nor like any of the watery beers he was used to from taps at continental bars. This stuff had a flavor like roasted nuts and fresh bread, very slightly sweet. There was no bitterness to it at all. It was a hearty beverage, creamy like true old-fashioned root beer, and there was some other flavor to it, some hint of herb he could not identify. He swallowed deep and felt the better for it, and though the brew was served at room temperature, he did not mind. It cooled and delighted him all the same. "What is this stuff?" he said after wiping foam from his mouth. "Sweet ale, you silly," said the girl smartly, who at her full height stood only to his chin. "You never tasted a true brew before, I'll wager." He could only shake his head and take another deep draught of the stuff as the children came by and rapped on the window and door of the pub. A middle-aged man, portly and balding, opened the door and grimaced as if in shock to see them. In feigned terror he shouted for his patrons to help appease the horde, and many of the men came forward, drawing forth little packets from jacket pockets. These they poured into a large brown paper sack which they gave to the barkeep, who dispersed the contents by handfuls to the waiting children. Some of the little round offerings appeared to be ball-shaped confections rolled in crushed nuts. Others were clearly acorns, doubtless gathered from the transplanted oak woods that surrounded the village. The children ate the sweets and ran off to bring the acorns to the dancing teens, and in a moment the procession was on its way to the next abode. "What did they get?" Sweyn asked. A man beside him, one of those who had called him into the tavern, clapped his shoulder and said they were just ordinary nuts, but some had been leached of tannins and roasted and glazed with honey and spice and were eaten like candy. The others were live acorns that would be planted later, after dark. With the crowd of youths past, musicians at the back of the tavern struck up some wild tune on low whistles and fiddles. Their song sprinted along in the rapid staccato spirals of Celtic reels, and some adults got up to dance. They formed two lines facing each other, men on one side, women on the other. From waiting baskets they drew holly boughs and crossed them over the space between the lines to make arches for a holly hall. Then the couple at the head of the lines lowered their branches, linked arms, and skipped through the holly hall. At the end of it, they rejoined the lines and raised their branches again, and as soon as their boughs were up, the next couple at the head went through. As each couple took its turn through the holly hall and fell back in at the end of the queue, everyone in the lines did a sidewise skip that brought them a pace back toward the beginning. So the queue was in constant motion, each couple skipping from head to rear, then dancing in the lines back to the head again. Sweyn watched them as he drank the sweet ale, bemused, when the petite girl with the red curly locks tugged his hand and gestured toward the dancers. "Oh no, I couldn't," he protested. "I don't know your dances." But with firm gestures and tugs and not a few dire glares, she coaxed him toward the dance, held on a partition of polished wood floor the hue of clover honey. The girl led him by the hand, weaving smoothly between standing folk chatting lively over earthenware mugs of foamy sweet ale. There was a fruity, spicy scent on the air too, and Sweyn realized it came from cider of apples and pears. But all the chatter and heady aromas blurred into the background when they reached the dance floor. The girl grabbed holly boughs and handed Sweyn one, then linked arms with him and led him skipping beneath the holly hall. At the end they added their boughs to the arches. The pace of the dance was fast, and Sweyn and the red-haired girl went through the queue time and again, the girl laughing gleefully each time it was their turn to skip beneath the boughs. Even on Sweyn's grim face a smile finally broke through his stony features. He had not known the pleasure of a simple dance in 3 years. Then suddenly the music changed and the holly hall dancers stepped aside. Ladies wearing green short dresses and men wearing black trousers of heavy cloth and white, loose chemises took the dance floor. They stood straight and tall and began skipping in the way of Irish step dancers. The pub folk made a ring around them and cheered them on. Many gleeful mugs were raised to the step dancers, who responded to their encouragement with more daring skips and kicks and broad, proud grins for the onlookers. The musicians responded to the dancers' zeal by accelerating the tempo. Then the musicians exchanged their reel for a faster jig. The onlookers began dancing again, this time forming a ring out of the men, and the women wove to and fro between them. As each went her way, she selected a partner and drew him into the spiraling center, pirouetting as she led him. At the center of the ring, each man and dame danced round and round till centrifugal force sent them staggering out. It was great fun, and Sweyn was drawn into the flow by one fine girl and another, who each smiled and curtsied like a maiden of a bygone era. Sweyn learned the art of saluting the ladies with a florid bow from watching the men. Another dance followed, and another, and still another, and then a faceless man pressed another drink into his hand, to welcome the new laird. But Sweyn said nothing about the title. He was all sweat and motion by that time, and was only too glad to down the foamy drink. This time it was far sweeter, a cider, with only a hint of potency concealed beneath the flavor of fermented pear and spice. Another man clapped his back and guided him from the dance floor into a small gathering of gabbing bystanders, where he was drawn into conversation of small things: farmers' hopes for the coming year, orders of seed, hopes for the annual salmon run. And wasn't Sweyn himself a sailor to know the way of the sea? Some asked if Sweyn might fish with them come the salmon run. Mindlessly he nodded and gestured and flowed with the conversation until, at some moment, it occurred to him these people were other than the dull rustics he had first taken them for. They were keen and transparent, and, most peculiarly, they were happy. Really, truly happy. He had never known the simple pleasure of life they enjoyed. His entire life had been struggle and ordeal, but for the 3 brief years Aylwin had been at his side. Whatever made these people as they were, it was alien to him. Too much for him. He suddenly felt painfully out of place. He set down his mug, looked desperately to the exit. He rose without a farewell, the chair scudding back, almost toppling, when suddenly the pub musicians quit playing. From outside, where darkness was descending, came another melody, aching sad, piercing the heart. And there were many flickering lights passing beyond the window. People began to drift out of the pub in little groups of 2s and 4s. They went slowly, the thinning of the crowd almost imperceptible, yet shortly the pub was all but empty, and Sweyn found himself alone at the table where moments before he had thought to make an escape from the endless chatter of the farmers and their wives. It seemed he might have, in only a moment, the solitude he had craved seconds ago, but suddenly it made him sad. He did not know why. But then the girl with the red locks was there, and she placed a hand on his and beckoned him to follow. He did not mean to, but he found himself accompanying her into the street. Just left, up the brick road leading north, a second procession of all-grown folk had passed, and they carried torches. At their lead were 3 folk playing Irish flutes, and he realized the grieving music he had heard spilled from their instruments. The girl led him up the road, following in the wake of the adult procession. Sweyn went as if in a dream, but he became aware that more musicians were coming up behind them, perhaps 50 yards back. Glancing that way, he saw 3 persons, 2 ladies and a man, playing small harps strung with silvery wire. The instruments chimed like bells as the players plucked the strings, using their fingernails like picks. And where the flutist played a song of darkness and mourning, the harpers played spring sunbeams. The adult procession wound its way up the main street to the edge of the village. At the forest's edge, a tiny, arched bridge, just wide enough for persons to pass 2 abreast, led over a fast-flowing little brook. Torches had been mounted on the bridge, and every person crossed there, though the brook could easily have been leapt. But it felt as if doing so would be disrespectful somehow. Beyond the bridge, a dirt path led into Manannan's oak wood. In the night, owls hooted. The thick canopy of oak boughs carried echoes of the brook's babbling, and it sounded like voices whispering in the tall dark of the trees. Sparkles winked from the depths of the woods, sparkles that seemed like fireflies, except Sweyn knew there were no fireflies in this part of the world. The procession sang songs as they went, in Gaelic, and Sweyn was disappointed that he could not sing along. The songs sounded old as the ages, full of yearning. They found their way to a moonlit glade, and there they halted their march. The children were just returning from the depths of the forest. Bright young faces glowed in torchlight, smudged by the forest loam. In earth-blackened hands the children carried fluffy pastries which sparkled like glowing stars, and Sweyn could not understand how the bakers had created the effect. Many of the children chewed happily on the scintillating pastries. Sweyn asked the girl where the children had gotten the cakes. "From the wee folk in the wood," she answered in her crisp brogue, as if it should be plain and obvious. Sweyn looked back at the children and realized they had been in the wood planting the acorns. Doubtless the wee folk had been other adults who came out here earlier and left the treats for them to find as they worked. Logs for a bonfire had been stacked in the midst of the glade, and an old man stepped forward out of the crowd. His name was Fergus, and the girl explained he was their Shawnachie. He told the villagers a tale, an old tale, of how the first forest had bloomed out of the first spring, and in that forest dwelt the Tylwyth Teg, and faerie-kin, and later came mortal folk who would become their friends and allies. The Tylwyth Teg taught mortal folk that when the sun faded in winter, they should mourn it solemnly, for it meant the green man was dying. But when the sun waxed again in spring, they should welcome it gaily, for the green man had revived. The way to honor the green man, the Shanachie said, was to seed life and revel in its bounty. And so to this day the folk of Man by the Sea remember the old wisdom and plant the forest each Bealtseina, and live to the fullest, and remember the old tales. Then the Shanachie said something in a brisk but elegant tongue. "It is Manish, our old tongue," whispered the red-haired girl. She told him he should learn it, being the laird, for now she explained what he said. "It is a blessing upon spring, a farewell to the dark time, when the green man died. The words are very old. They say we learned them from the druids who walk the wood no more." The horned one must have been standing in the shadows of the oaks, for he materialized into the light of the torches, as if out of the air. The bonfire logs of elm and holly had been well oiled. 4 men, wielding bows armed with black arrows that had been dipped in pitch, lit their arrows with matches and shot them into the logs from 4 directions, north, east, south, and west. Flame rushed up in a bright flash, momentarily blinding Sweyn. When the brilliant after-images faded away, the horned man had vanished. Then people hugged one another, and children ran to parents to show them their glowing fairy cakes, and tell them of their adventures in the night wood. And then, it now being after midnight, weary couples and families drifted from the forest, leaving Sweyn to guard the remnants of the fire as if it were his lairdly obligation. And so he stood alone by the dying embers of the fire, pondering. Never in his life had he seen anything like this. It left him feeling full, and it left him feeling empty, and at first he did not understand the queer sensation. Then it came to him that he felt as if he had just discovered something he always should have known, but never did. The realization made his heart ache deep within. He leaned against an oak at the edge of the glade and watched the fire burn down until it was smoke and ash fading into a lavender dawn. The strangest thing was, for the first time ever since the passing of Eowyn, he felt something other than sorrow. He felt right? He did not understand it, and it frightened him. And in the wake of that fear, at the back of his heart the direst memories threatened to break like a storm. He wanted to run from them as he always had, lest the flashbacks take him. But where had he been running to all these years? Here? An almost voice breathed in answer to his unspoken question. It sounded like Eowyn's hushed whisper. He was almost tempted to turn and try to see her, but she was dead, and to look for her was to descend into madness. Ghosts did not walk the earth. No, the voice from within, it was his own wishful thinking. Besides, Eowyn would never tell him here. Not here. Eowyn had hated here. Chapter 4. They say a ghost comes as a wisp or a shadow, to haunt with cold sweats and dark wails. But I, who have told many tales, say you may know a ghost by the force of its presence, on the shaping of its purpose. Fergus Kilwillie, Shanachie of Man by the Sea. He stood upon the prow of a handsome sailing yacht, not his starry sea, but elegant and winsome all the same. Her lines were full and swept, her hull cutting deep into the sea and tapering to a stout keel. Her shape was traditional, a fine boat that could keep to its feet in a storm. Her deck was all of dark wood, and much beautiful bright work of stainless steel and brass and smooth sanded teak gleamed in the noonday sun. A fresh wind whipped cool salt spray from the waves, scattered it lightly over him, like gems of cold in the summer heat. The little ship was ketch-rigged, and she proudly flew all her sails, but she was reefed so as not to overpower the craft, for the breeze had continued to stiffen all day. The tightly sheeted sails shone like dazzling white wings against the slate sky, and they were filled out elegantly smooth, their leeches so perfectly tensioned they did not so much as rustle. Their telltale streamed straight back, testifying to the skill of the sailor who had trimmed the sheets. He looked back at Eowyn and smiled. She was turning into quite the sea woman. Now Eowyn stood in the cockpit, holding a traditional wooden wheel, a full 4 feet in diameter by the handholds mounted around its circumference. Her brow was furrowed in intense concentration as she balanced the desired course against the whims of wind and sea. Off the bow, to the north and east, the metropolis of Seattle gleamed glassy and gray in the early afternoon sun. They were making for the city on a tight, close reach. The little ship heeled steeply away from the wind, and always felt precariously close to rolling. But there was no danger. The heavy-keeled craft would hold its own easily in this minor blow. They were completing a sea trial, and found this vessel to be all they had hoped for. At a full 60 feet, she was far larger than Starry Sea, but she was fast, nimble, and more forgiving. A good ship for the novices who would ride her. When they returned to the docks of Seattle, they would buy her. This little ship, to be christened Cerulean, a name Eowyn had chosen, would be Sweyn's living. He had been certified as a captain, and they planned to open a charter business with this vessel. And after they closed on the boat, they had other business waiting in Seattle. In a few days they would meet their lawyer and complete the purchase of a small cottage in the woods on the outskirts of Glacier Falls. The cottage was a delicate, cozy affair, high-gabled with boxed herbs beneath the windows and half-wild lilacs scattered round about its tiny yard. Vines grew up its stone walls, and great cedars sheltered it, so that the place, yard, cottage, and all, seemed on the verge of being swallowed up again by the rainforest. Éowyn had loved it from the first, said it reminded her of home. This fairy-tale cottage in its sylvan setting would be perfect for Éowyn's tea and herb shop. The previous owner was an elderly matron who desired to move to warmer climes south, and she and Éowyn had already sealed the deal with a handshake. Éowyn had even already begun redecorating it. As far as the ladies were concerned, the deal was done. Only the signing of some papers waited to make it official. So the coming days held exciting things. They would undertake new careers together as a couple. For the first time in their lives, they would make livings of their true passions, and Sweyn took this as a good omen, for the changes symbolized leaving their old lives and starting new ones together. He walked back to the helm and poured a cup of tea from a stainless steel thermos, offered it to her. "Want me to take over?" he asked. She shook her head, her untamable ruby locks flailing in the wind. "I'm having fun," she said. Her eyes twinkled. He fell into the starboard side bench, the side to which the boat was heeling. Near him the sea foamed as the boat flew smoothly over it, cutting the waves, breaking the water into tracks around it. Something had been eating at Sweyn that afternoon, an old issue that resurfaced from time to time. He contemplated it over Éowyn's cup of tea. Discussing it never went well, but everything was so perfect today. Maybe Éowyn would be in more agreeable spirits this time. "We're on a northerly course," he ventured after finishing half the mug. So maybe, after we pay for this old lady, he tapped cerulean, we should keep on going. It was a sore point in their relationship, and no matter how he broached it, it always had the same effect on her. She took a deep breath and set her eyes firmly on the prow, as if narrowing her attention to the point where Sweyn and everything but the prow and the seaway directly before it was outside her scope of awareness. Unmoving, except for the slight adjustments of her hands on the helm, she stood for a long time. Miles of sea flowed past. At last Sweyn sighed, tossed the now cold dregs of tea overboard, and made to rise. But then Éowyn spoke, stilling him. In a flat voice she said, "If you must go north, we'll plot a course to Alaska. We can sail straight for it and be there in 12 days. He regarded her, struggling to decipher the hidden things churning beneath her mask of concentration, but he could not. When Éowyn chose to tune him out, she blocked him out too. Finally he said, "Éowyn, we've been married a year now, and I've never even seen where you come from. I don't know anything about your home. It doesn't seem right." "You're none too fond of your home either," she pointed out crisply. "I dunna bother you to go there." He thought her brogue, even half washed away with years of American living, was enchanting, and when she grew upset it became all the thicker. Sometimes he was tempted to tease her in order to bring it out, but she had a point. All that was left of his home was his father, and he and his father were volatile, best not mixed. Still, she had at least met his father once, and seen Sweyn's hometown. He had never even seen her island, nor did he really know anything of her family or friends or past. It was like she had no life prior to him, and she was determined it should stay that way, which just wasn't fair. Somewhat frustrated, he replied, "Éowyn, you know we can visit where I come from any time." "So let's turn south then. We'll buy the boat and make our maiden voyage to Oregon." He exhaled loudly, rubbed his brow. The debate was over before it had really even begun, but he was still not quite ready to give it up. "I'd really like to do this, Éowyn. Man by the sea. It's part of you. We've known each other all this time, but sometimes it feels like I don't know you." Her mood softened. She could never stay mad at Sweyn. "Are you saying the great Dr. Sweyn cannot figure out a simple country girl?" "A simple country girl you aren't." However remote, however bucolic her home, there was nothing unsophisticated about Éowyn. "I'd really like to know what kind of village in the sticks can churn out such a fine lady as I've had the good fortune to meet. For that matter, I'd like to know what kind of place in North America can churn out folk with a fine Scottish brogue." "It's no Scots brogue. It's mannish, unique to my island. Trust me, it's different from what you'd hear in the old world." He recalled a small rhyme she had taught him once, a bit of local verse contrived to help island children remember their history. "Of all the Celtic folk we be, last of 5 clans westerly." His thoughts wandered. It's odd such a colourful place as your island isn't well known. You'd think Manannan would have become popular with the tourists with all that old-world charm. She glanced this way, said, "If the tourists found it, it would lose what it is. It would become just another exhibition. Mannish folk know this. They value that they've been overlooked by the world and consider it their good fortune." "Well, Éowyn," he pressed, "I'm not the world. I'm part of you. That makes me part of Manannan. The change that came over Éowyn was unexpected and instantaneous. She was a small woman with great guileless doe eyes and a natural sweet set to her mouth, but in the instant Sweyn uttered his pronouncement, her entire aspect changed. Her eyes took on fire, her jaw clenched. She seemed to grow, not in stature, but in presence, as if reality itself were suddenly swirling into the vortex of the storm of her emotions. She turned and faced him directly, all charm lost to a dangerous and seething feminine outrage. "Dinna say that," she commanded. "Never, ever say that." The vehemence of her reaction stunned him, hurt him. He stared at her in shock. Through clenched teeth she hissed, "You'll never be part of Manannan. It'll never happen." But in another instant she changed again, and the dangerous shadow vanished as if it never were, and Sweyn wondered if he had imagined the whole thing. But her eyes testified otherwise. Things still lingered behind them. Things he could not, though he tried desperately, understand. She looked ahead again, to the prow, but he knew she was not seeing what lay ahead. She saw something behind her, something dreadful and old, and not yet distant enough. She would never talk of it, but her eyes held anger and fury and hurt all at once, and then she closed them and summoned strength from somewhere deep, and when she opened them again, whatever unwanted recollections that revisited her were gone. Now she looked only at Sweyn, regret softening her features. "I'm sorry," she said. He nodded and accepted it. He always did. It was not yet time. She was not yet ready. One day, perhaps. He could wait. That night Cerulean was theirs, the deal sealed, and they had celebrated by painting her name on her stern straight away in sloppy, quickly scrawled letters of water paint that would dissolve easily away back in Glacier Falls when Sweyn did a professional job of repainting and refurbishing the old boat. But for now it was dark, and they were tied up to a pier in Seattle. They sat in the cockpit having dinner together on the table that, when not in use, folded down into the binnacle. Overhead the sky was clear and black as pitch, except for the glimmer of a few bright stars that braved the wash of orange city light. They ate simple fare of flounder and chips and washed it down with wine. Meandering up the companionway from the speakers in the forward stateroom, the soft notes of something classical flowed around them as gently as the harbor wavelets lapping the hull. The Moonlight Sonata. They were halfway through their meal, chewing slowly and in silence, enjoying each other's quiet company when Éowyn's eyes took on that distant look. Not the twinkle they acquired when some clever scheme entered her thoughts, but the hollow cast that marked when she glimpsed back into her unclear past. She set down her fork and knife and said in a small voice, "Sweyn, do you love me?" Immediately he nodded. "There's no question." "Then please, if you love me, dinna ever ask her to go to Man by the Sea again. It's no a place I would wish upon you." But why, he wanted to ask. Sometimes she talked about the village and the island, and she spoke of them as though they were dearest to her heart. And on some nights she told tales of the strange history and old legends surrounding her remote home, and her story sent pleasant frissons up both their spines. Brightly she spoke of the island's many unusual personages who managed to preserve a way of life centuries dead elsewhere. Yearning filled her reminiscences at those times, a deep abiding homesickness that came through her words. But there were other times she refused even to mention the name of the Island of Manannan, and would brook no reminders of its existence. The paintings she had created of its little village and fields and farms and forests came down from the walls, vanished into the attic, and she swore she would never give the island thought again. But as if the island called to her, always, in time, the pictures reappeared on the wall, and Éowyn returned to her teetering balance of love and hate for her remote home. Yet in this moment she was so intense that he could only nod. Though he was hungry to understand the mystery that was his wife, in this instant she appeared so small and focused and afraid. He could do nothing else but agree, could not even recall why he wanted to go to her island. She leaned across the small table. Her voice was only a hushed whisper now, as if she were afraid something might overhear her words, take them away, and somehow shape them against her. "Do you believe in magic?" she asked him. It was absolutely the last thing Sweyn had expected her to say. He cocked his head to one side, his left eye half squinting, his right eyebrow half up, his own unique expression of perplexity. I guess I've never thought about it." "Well, I think on it for you. It's everything in the fairy tale," she went on. "It's all sparkles and enchanted woods and fairy glitter." She grew silent and looked behind her, into the inky waters of the nighttime bay, full of the silver and orange scintillating lights of the city beyond the pier. "And it's dark, too. It's glamour. It gives you hope, and then it steals away what you hold most dear." She looked back up at him. Her dark eyes were full of phantoms and shades. She was now quite the opposite of that fighter upon the waves he had glimpsed this afternoon. Now she was only a girl, small and afraid, and she continued to glance at the water as if searching for hidden movement. Her voice dropped even lower, so low he strained to hear across the small space of the tiny table. "Never ask me to take ye to man by the sea. You could not guess what I've lost there. I will not lose ye too, no matter the cost." It was a strange thing to say, an enigmatic thing, and he could not imagine what could possibly frighten this strong woman so. But in this instant, she didn't look strong. She looked only like a lost child, and he felt compelled to comfort her. "I'm not going anywhere, Aylwyn," he assured her. "I promise." That was the last she had spoken of her distant island home, the last till the final year, so near the end, when the letter came. You have been listening to An Ogham Wood by Cliff Serentine, read by Cliff Serentine, available from Amazon on Kindle and in hard copy.